Hello.
Welcome to this commentary of Abe's Oddysee, which is a blend between critical analysis, love letter, and walkthrough for 101% completion. Abe's Oddysee was released by Oddworld Inhabitants in 1997 for the PS1 and PC under the leadership of Lorne, Lanning, and McKenna. It gained critical acclaim, many industry awards, and a tightly knit cult following, which is why I thought it deserved the long-form commentary treatment. This was very much inspired by videos like those of Matthewmatosis, so if you'll enjoy this, I thoroughly recommend his content, as well as Noah Caldwell-Gervais and Racer Aesthetics. As is par for the course, be wary of heavy spoilers, and a fair warning for those of you who are not into painfully verbose explanations. Without further ado, we'll jump right in, and the introductory cutscene sets the mood for its portrayal of Rupture Farms as an industrial hellscape. The opening shot of the factory might have been inspired by the album cover of Pink Floyd's Animals, which features the Battersea Power Station, but in the more classically dark style of the 90s. This notion is somewhat supported by Lorne Lanning, the creative director, who stated in his Ars Technica interview that Animals and the Wall in particular influenced his artistic vision. From a narrative standpoint, the cutscene concisely introduces the main characters, Abe and Moloch. Abe belongs to the fictional species of Mudokons and is an innocently ignorant slave, while Moloch, a Glukkon, is an exploitative and ruthless corporate owner. The increasing scarcity of wildlife to turn into meat products prompts Moloch's plan to turn Mudokons into popsicles, a plot point loosely adapted from the 70s movie Soylent Green. It's obvious that all the species are allegories for real-life socioeconomic classes, which we will explore in depth as we go, but the core dynamic between the two factions is already well codified by Abe and Moloch. The first game's story is quite simple and initially is focused on Abe's escape, the primary motivation being self-preservation. The intro cutscene in the demo version has Abe ask the player for help to rescue the other Mudokons, but this was removed from the release version, likely to better align with the intended narrative structure. Given the novel setting and the relatively unexplored potential of games as an artistic medium at the time, the story's simplicity can be forgiven. In fact, it's even an asset for a first entry in a franchise, as the simple plot allowed the creative team to focus more thoroughly on world building without getting bogged down by narrative minutiae. From a technical standpoint, I can't overstate how impressive the cutscenes are, especially given the year of release. The pre-rendering technique allowed for high-quality cinematography with many panning panoramic shots and atmospheric lighting and other effects without overstepping the capabilities of PCs and consoles at the time. The strong direction shines even more by having the pre-rendered footage enmeshed with the actual game via transitions such as the one right at the start. The switch is noticeable due to a difference in image graininess, but it nonetheless allows for a sleek segue into the actual game. Unfortunately, a symptom of the game's age is its 4:3 aspect ratio, which can't be transposed to 16:9 without stretching, but at least we can use the extra space for illustrative purposes without obstructing the game view. As for the gameplay itself, Oddysee is a 2D cinematic platformer. The subgenre was primarily pioneered by American game designer Jordan Mechner with the release of 1989's Prince of Persia, and later codified by French developer R.E.L.I.V.E with Another World for the Amiga in 1991. Other classic pre-2000s titles include Heart of Darkness, released under Amazing Studios, also with Shai's involvement, Flashback by French developer Delphine Software as a spiritual successor to Another World, and Blackthorn, an often overlooked Blizzard gem. While post-2000s the genre is relatively forgotten, there have been sporadic revival attempts, with the most successful titles being Limbo and Inside by Danish studio Playdead, and both Little Nightmares titles by Swedish developer Tarsier Studios. Historically, cinematic platformers were an attempt at realistic side-scrollers and were aimed more at expanding the capabilities of video games as an artistic medium as opposed to their more arcade-themed contemporaries. They typically prioritize experiential gameplay and storytelling, with some of their staples being minimal to no UI, instant deaths, infinite lives, and aesthetics built around realism or some stylized variant of it. This focus naturally extends to the gameplay, with particular attention given to realism in animations and movement. I've heard Abe's movement control described as finicky, a sentiment with which I disagree. In Oddysee, movement distance is determined by superimposing a fixed horizontal grid on the seemingly continuous play area, to which all of Abe's motions are then locked. Any step displaces him precisely one unit on the grid, and all other movement can be quantified in terms of steps. For example, hopping from a standing position always moves Abe 3 steps forward. Movement profiles are then used to expand Abe's moveset. Running increases speed and jumping distance but must account for changes in momentum when starting or stopping. Rolling prohibits jumping but allows Abe to crawl through narrow spaces and is just as fast as running and more precise due to lacking momentum buildups. Another important aspect is that, much like the Souls games, Abe has uninterruptible animations except for some transition points between certain animation frames. This gives the dual benefit of ensuring that Abe always remains locked to the grid while cutting down on the animation budget. These two aspects reduce movement to a problem of arithmetic and timing. The displacement required for obstacle clearance can be precisely calculated and perfectly reenacted as long as input timing fits the cadence of the animations. When taken on these terms, after some accommodation, the controls start feeling highly deterministic and reliable. This is in contrast to classic side-scrollers where the controls are more reactive to the player's input but actually require more finesse and skill to perfectly replicate movement sequences. For such games, however, the system works because the game relies on pseudo-continuous positioning as opposed to the grid system, meaning characters may arbitrarily reposition themselves with pixel precision. The pseudo part stems from the fact that, from the computer's perspective, positioning is not actually continuous, since it ultimately only operates on strictly discrete values, but the level of granularity is so high that it becomes practically imperceptible for a human user. I should now address the room with the elephant in it, the first secret area, cleverly hidden right on the first screen behind the barrel in the foreground. The puzzle is quite sophisticated for the early game, and it's obvious this was only intended to be discovered on subsequent playthroughs after gaining some experience. Lorne Lanning has expressed explicit grievances with game walkthroughs available at the time, which guided the player directly to this secret on their first playthrough, which had the unintended side effect of overwhelming and discouraging them. The levers operated some combination of meat saws and electric walls, and to rescue the Mudokons here we must interleave sequences of lever operations with Mudokon interactions. I showcase two solutions just to demonstrate that some puzzles have some flexibility with regards to viable approaches. As opposed to horizontal movement, the vertical one mostly consists of hoisting up ledges. However, vertical units do not seem as rigidly fixed. My only comment here is that some additional options like ladders and stairs could have been included for realism. While Rupture Farms has a relatively horizontal layout, all the ledges strain credibility and beg the question about how Sligs, a common enemy without vertical movement capabilities, can even naturally reach some areas, so a few vertical navigation options for them would have both helped with internal consistency and allowed for more interesting level design. Speaking of, we now have our first proper Slig encounters. The first Slig is the one from the cinematic, which is a nice bit of continuity. The game urges the player to hurry, but they aren't in any danger until they climb the first ledge. The second one in particular is also nice, because the barrier protects the player if the Slig starts shooting, and having the barrier dented by bullets is a nice touch. We are also introduced to doors, which help bridge disconnected areas, and the background plane, which effectively turns Oddysee into a 2.5D game. Alongside that, we get the no talking to fellow employees sign, which not only makes sense in universe, but is a rather cheeky way to instruct the player. Naturally, they should talk to other Mudokons to save them, only not in a Slig's presence. This enforcement of silence and the mouth stitches gives some insight into the etymology of Mudokon. The term seems derived from mudo, meaning mute in Portuguese and Spanish, though it does not describe the actual nature of Mudokons so much as their current predicament as slaves, further reinforced by how awkward Abe's voice lines are, as if he is reluctant to speak. We are also introduced to the sneaking profile. Unlike the other movement profiles, sneaking does not change movement speed, but is instead quieter, calling to attention that sound itself is also a gameplay mechanic. In this introductory segment, we must sneak past a sleeping Slig to pull a lever deactivating an electric wall. We also meet our first non-secret Mudokon, and given that this is likely the first one encountered by most first-time players, more attention was given to the setup. Not only do you have small environmental details such as the bucket, but having the Mudokon scrub the wall while upright makes them stand out. Another important detail is that the Mudokon is washing a bloodstain, and even though Rupture Farms is a meat factory, I like that there is some deliberate ambiguity as to its origin, a kind of visual plausible deniability. Shortly after, we have another Mudokon in what is practically the first instance where the developers prank the player. They instruct the player about how to pull levers, but doing so will drop the Mudokon down a trapdoor to their death, and the purpose of this encounter is to be a minor test of situational awareness. Failing it not only teaches the player a lesson about minding details, but also results in some deliberate slapstick. Fortunately, for players who want to right their wrongs, the checkpoint is not that far behind. Right now we're solving another secret area, hidden underneath a trapdoor, and the tell is the off-screen sound of a snoring Slig. In interviews, Lorne Lanning confirmed such clues to be intentional, which showcases the importance of sound design as a gameplay element. Now that our familiarity with Sligs is growing, we should introduce the etymology of the term. Slig is a portmanteau between slug and pig, and given their position in the hierarchy of rupture farms, the pig part seems to be derived from the real-life pejorative used to describe law enforcement agents, especially the corrupt kind. Oddysee itself is not particularly interested in creating any sympathy for the Sligs, which is understandable for the first entry in the series, but later titles establish that while Sligs are clearly aggressors and are marginally more privileged, they themselves are also Glukkon slaves and treated as equally disposable. In fact, the dynamic between Mudokons and Sligs can be seen as a species-wide Stanford prison experiment and can serve as an allegory about how groups may be pitted against each other by establishing artificial hierarchies and inhumane incentive structures. The earlier secret introduced us to the boom machine, effectively grenade dispensers. It is strange that a meatpacking factory full of slaves would have these at all, something that Reddit user Nemin pointed out in their Oddysee commentary on Oddworlds.hu. Nevertheless, without them it would be very difficult to save the Mudokons here. Lorne Lanning was opposed to R.E.L.I.V.E having guns because it would trivialize the puzzles, but grenades fit quite well with this design philosophy because they are slow and can be used creatively by exploiting their physics. The last loose end on this level is one more secret below the mines in the first jumping puzzle. As before, it's behind a foreground barrel, and this consistency in early secret placement was quite generous as it did allow us as children to find a few of them without access to the internet. Unlike the others, this secret is more obvious to spot. The game uses falling debris to let the player know where there are off-screen ledges above or below, and some debris is visible underneath the mines. What might perplex the player instead is how to reach it if they haven't found one of the secret grenade machines laying around. There is one on the main path but much further away, requiring a lot of backtracking. The secret is an even simpler variation of the very first one, and rather than being an interesting puzzle, it instead highlights the limitation of only being able to talk to one Mudokon at a time, something that Exodus addressed perfectly. While we handle the tedium, it's a good chance to talk about GameSpeak, which makes Oddysee a novelty on the scene of cinematic platformers. One way I've seen it described is as Prince of Persia meets Lemmings, an old puzzle game where the titular lemmings must be safely guided through hazardous levels. The name Lemmings is derived from the false myth that real-life lemmings mindlessly commit mass suicide by marching aimlessly off cliffs. The myth was in part popularized by White Wilderness, a 1958 Disney documentary, but it has since been shown that the lemmings in their footage were in fact pushed off cliffs by the filming crew using turntables. This form of exploitation for nothing more than sensationalism fittingly matches Oddysee's themes, if only by coincidence. If you are into puzzle games and losing hair, I do recommend Lemmings as it's definitely an innovative spin on game design. Leading Mudokons is likely inspired by Lemmings, but while Oddysee's puzzles are much simpler, you often have to simultaneously consider both their safety and your own. In fact, saving Mudokons is completely optional and occasionally quite difficult, so players might be tempted to ignore them altogether or even kill them on purpose, and the game rarely penalizes them mechanically for that. If the player decides to save them, however, GameSpeak becomes an integral part of the experience. GameSpeak commands are not too complicated, and the only ones needed for Mudokon saving are hello, follow me, and wait, but what I find most impressive is the lengths to which the developers went when programming Mudokon reactions across the board to make them seem more natural. When following Abe, Mudokons will mimic his movement profile, such as running or sneaking. The only exception is rolling, during which they will run instead to match Abe's speed. They will not actually walk off ledges blindly and must be asked to follow Abe again to coax them into making that extra step. Conversely, if the Mudokon cannot get any closer, they will audibly refuse. Telling Mudokons to wait when they were already not following Abe will cause them to express anger. When Abe expresses anger, Mudokons will innocently feign ignorance as if to exonerate themselves in front of the player. When Abe farts or bumps into a wall, Mudokons will laugh. If Abe laughs, they will mirror this interaction by farting instead. Lastly, when Abe whistles, Mudokons will mimic the same tune. GameSpeak soundbites are effectively used to make characters feel more alive by having them react to certain events. Killing a Mudokon will have Abe say whoops, bumping into walls will have him react in anger, or he will laugh when saving a Mudokon or killing a Slig. This also applies to other characters, for example how Sligs laugh if Abe dies while they are present. The lower floor of Rupture Farms, which we will visit shortly, formally introduces the player to GameSpeak and Mudokon rescuing, and the LED messages even encourage the player to experiment with GameSpeak commands. At this point we have already rescued 8 out of 99 Mudokons, and the employee board helps us keep track of our progress. It's subtly humorous, but there seems to be a punch clock mechanism on some of the boards, an obsolete real-world system for recording the coming and going of employees so as to calculate wages at the end of the month. That, and referring to the Mudokon slaves as employees, shines a light on this practice of some corporations of using marketable euphemisms to mask the bleak reality. The game also explains more clearly the function of bird portals, so for any players who hadn't rescued the earlier Mudokons, this incentivizes them to backtrack and try it. Unfortunately, on the PC version, the LED message board states that chanting can be performed by holding Alt and Shift, which correspond to shoulder buttons on the gamepad, but that doesn't seem to actually work, which might leave some players confused. Despite all the praise, Oddysee does have slightly sloppy control mappings, a typical symptom for console ports at the time. Other issues are how for some commands, such as GameSpeak, the key needs to be pressed for longer than usual, or that the game sometimes does not treat keyboard inputs atomically and instead first converts them to the equivalent gamepad bindings and then feeds them to the game, meaning combinations of certain keys sometimes lead to unexpected output. I find Oddysee technically competent, but we will see a few unaccounted for corner cases and bugs along the way, which highlight how difficult software development and especially game development can be. Software QA can be a highly precarious and expensive process. The technique with the least automated infrastructure is definitely manual QA, but it's quite obvious that it doesn't scale well in terms of man-hours and is still prone to human error. Unit testing and a derived regression testing setup are better choices, but tests do not always offer perfect code coverage, and writing them may more than double development efforts, at least initially. The most principled approaches are formal methods that involve reasoning about programs mathematically or algorithmically to prove properties such as correctness, which is probably too abstract for this particular video, but I'll make a best effort to explain them briefly in layman terms. One way to think about it is using computer programs to make sure other computer programs are bug-free. Some techniques are fully automatic, where you basically give the game code to the analyzer program, which inspects it and says yay or nay depending on whether the game is definitely bug-free, according to some definition of bug. Due to some theoretical limitations, such analyzers will never be capable of categorically saying whether a program is definitely correct or not. What this means is that a program may effectively be correct, but the analyzer cannot reason about it precisely enough to conclude this, so it conservatively flags it as potentially buggy. The theoretical limitation in question is the infamous halting problem, a foundational concept in computer science, which I'll not delve into here, but rest assured you can find plenty of resources on it on the internet. Another technique, formal verification, involves constructing proofs about individual programs that can show beyond all doubt, with robust mathematics, that they behave as expected. These proofs can be constructed by hand or by using a mix of automation and manual work in the form of proof assistants, programs that essentially oversee and validate the construction steps of logical and mathematical proofs. While these techniques give you the best guarantees for program correctness, theoretical limitations aside, their bigger issue is that they require grad to post-grad qualifications to even understand, let alone apply. This might have made it hard to come by for an entertainment company in the 90s. Just to hammer home how important this is, Lorne Lanning mentioned in interviews that they discovered a game-breaking bug shortly before release and had to recall the discs they issued to retailers. It was a bigger hassle to amend such issues back then because of the logistics involved, whereas now you can simply deploy a patch via the internet. However, QA in whatever form is still a key requirement in software today, even for single-player games, because not only has the complexity of software also increased, but not all code is produced in-house. Dependencies on third-party open source or proprietary libraries can make these safety concerns relevant even today. We now encounter our first non-secret security orb, the red-eyed devices that zap Abe whenever he chants. We have already destroyed some to allow us to save some Mudokons, but it's not entirely clear yet how exactly they impact the gameplay. We also have another secret area, which has an additional tell on top of Sligs that can be heard walking off screen. When Sligs drop down death pits, they let out an echoing yell for help, unlike the one we just dropped. The only catch is to make sure you drop him while he is patrolling towards the left, otherwise the Slig will survive by landing on the upper floor, which makes this area slightly more difficult. The puzzle in the basement, however, is perhaps the most convoluted to solve with what we know at this point in the game. The trick is to get to the left platform without waking up the Slig and time a grenade to blow up the mine at the same time as the Slig wakes up. To make matters worse, there is only one shot at this, as it's incredibly difficult to go back to the grenade dispenser without getting Mudokons killed after the Slig wakes up. Also, I hope you didn't forget to shut down the meat grinder before leading the top Mudokon down, or you'll be treated to a Mudokon kebab. We haven't been formally introduced to meat grinders yet, but I have to say that I always found them quite menacing, and a good reason for this is their great design. First you have the dried blood, not only on the blades but also along the support beam, then there is the floor grate used to drain the blood, and also those animated spinning cylinders and cables behind them that all work together to make it better blend in the environment. Also, for some reason they never stop spinning, which makes sense for Rupture farms where violating safety regulations is practically the mission statement. In Abe's Exodus they are replaced with bone drills, which are actually better obstacles functionally because both their length, orientation and speed can be adjusted more freely, but for some reason I always found them less compelling than the grinders. On the main path, in the grinding area, jumps must be timed to avoid the falling carcasses, a natural progression in difficulty from the earlier mine jumping puzzle, which are completely static obstacles. This is paired with the first toggle mine, for which you must first observe its flashing pattern and press it when it flashes green to deactivate. You can actually just run jump over the toggle mine to get to the top, but it's generally good practice to embrace these introductory challenges as they are presented in the game, as they will eventually be unavoidable and even more difficult. An interesting fact is that the official name of the toggle mine is UXB, standing for Unexploded Bomb, which seems to be a misnomer because unexploded bombs are explosives that fail to detonate when deployed instead of toggleable explosives. This short section is concluded with a Mudokon in another situation that is unsolvable without an emergency grenade in tow. The Slig on the right can be dispatched with a trapdoor, but the same can't be said for the Slig on the left. A first-time player can simply run for it to get to the other side, but that will get the Mudokon killed. All main path Mudokons so far were either out of danger or could be ignored, but this one is the first to become collateral when not dealing with the active threats, which is a good way to instill regret in the player and get them more emotionally involved. Moving on, we are also presented with a sniper Slig that can shoot from the background, and the intent is to roll behind a pipe to escape safely. Snipers are scarcely used in Oddysee, but I do like their rendition here more than Exodus. This is mostly a flavorful distinction, but for some reason they have a much quicker rate of fire, and the bullets trailing behind Abe makes for some dramatic imagery. In Exodus, Sligs collectively need 3 shots to kill Abe, so the sniper's rate of fire was dialed back to the regular speed to better fit with this mechanic. Sniper Sligs can be especially scary on a first playthrough because their line of sight is hard to discern, but it is actually quite simple. It's a rectangle with the same height as the screen that starts at the Slig's position and extends until the vertical edge they are facing. The idea is to advance while the Slig is facing the opposite direction. We are also properly introduced to meat grinders with a handy practical demonstration. We have one Mudokon hidden in the shadows in this area, which can be heard scrubbing the floor if listening carefully, but there is another hint. The starting area does a good job of acclimating the player to its lack of UI, which I highlighted as a staple of cinematic platformers. Oddysee cleverly tackles the delicate task of instructing the player while maximizing immersion by repurposing elements in the game world. In Rupture farms, instructions are conveyed via scrolling LED message boards, painted signs, and the directory palm print scanners. LED boards offer guidance in the form of tutorials marked by green text, but they also have an actual in-universe purpose, namely the spread of Glukkon propaganda in red text. This effectively alleviates the way in which they break the fourth wall. These messages are bizarro twisted version of schlocky labor slogans seemingly designed to brainwash all the personnel into accepting their positions. But to tie this to the shaded Mudokon, hidden among the propaganda LED messages there is one that says, "You are not the only one who can hide in shadows," which creates this nice layering in communicating hints to the player. Painted signs serve a similar function but feature some distinct advantages and disadvantages. On the upside, they are more visually customizable, which allows them to be more evocative. On the flip side though, they have to be accounted for during level creation by featuring them in the rendering. Also, they are fixed in size, which can pose issues with localization, especially when porting to languages that feature long words like German. Unlike the other two, palm print scanners are mostly relegated to showing the map and information on Mudokon placement. The best part about all of these tutorial systems though is that all of them can be ignored entirely by experienced players. After a simple stealth sequence, there is a fork in the road where the door and the LED message draw the player's attention towards the main path, but there are still Mudokons to save by going rightwards. I wouldn't classify this as a secret area per se, but the difficulty of this segment might deter first-time players. Aside from the meat grinders, there is another prank lever that will drop a carcass on a poorly placed Mudokon when pulled, with only the gallons of blood underneath giving some warning. However, the way this trap is weaved with the next Slig encounter makes for a nice puzzle. This situation is trickier than the ones so far, as there is no high ground to fall back to, and the Slig is too close to other Mudokons to safely kill via grenade. However, with a bit of situational awareness, we can turn the tables in our favor. In my view, having the environment's lethality be a two-way street that can be turned against the enemies with a little creativity is one of the nicer aspects about Oddysee's balance and makes it feel fair. Succeeding here allows the player to save the 6 Mudokons in this area and even take the ball car to Zulag 2, though its door is locked at this point. To me, the availability of the ball car ride this early, coupled with Zulag 1's general openness, given that we could still backtrack all the way to the start of the level even now, both make Rupture Farms seem a bit more like a real place and give some foreshadowing of our eventual return. I don't want to overstate the importance of this openness in Oddysee because it can be completed in an almost entirely linear fashion, but it does have an unexpected emergent property. Exploring new areas was a delight as a child, but every screen flip introduced challenges of escalating difficulty. It doesn't help that, at that age of 5, each fret created a palpable sense of fear. Naturally, that fear caused me to backtrack to earlier areas where I felt safe, which would not have been possible without the openness. My behavior was obviously caused by age, which was way below the target demographic, but constantly swinging back and forth between areas I could clear did stimulate my curiosity and imagination about not only what creatures could be laying ahead, but also what the world itself would feel like to live in. While in many cases your imagination is more potent than seeing the concrete images presented by the artists, I have to say that Oddysee definitely did not disappoint, as we will soon see. I am about to demonstrate the ball car ride to Zulag 2 before heading to the next section, so to fill in the time, I'll point out some differences from the demo version. A bit of context, back in those days game demos were an industry standard, which were small chunks of the full game, typically the first level, found on discs that came for free with some products such as video game magazines or cereal boxes. Oddysee's demo followed this pattern by featuring Zulag 1, sans secret areas, and plus-minus differences in some obstacle placements, audio assets, or backgrounds. The more notable changes were in the Sniper Slig area, where the only Elim Chubbs poster was covered by an electric field in release, which might have been a missed opportunity to deliver a gut punch. Granted, the player would not know about Elim, our future mount, during the escape, but by the time of the return to Rupture Farms they would have established enough of a rapport for the poster to deliver some emotional impact. Aside from that, some accessways, such as the door to Zulag 2, are boarded up with no entry till September 1997 written on them, which only goes to further highlight how skilled the game designers and the artists are at seamlessly interweaving the game world with fourth wall breaking metatext. With all of these Mudokons saved, we are now free to go back to the main path. After heading down, with the sleek full motion video transition of course, we are faced with another crossroads. On the right we are blocked by an electric wall, but the player might be intrigued by these mysterious petroglyphs of running Mudokons. Leftwards we run past the Slig that can be heard dropping down and patrolling off screen. Just to showcase how good the sound design is, its proximity to the screen is conveyed by modulating the volume of its mechanical pants, which is useful for timing a grenade. The last standout feature on this level is the signpost saying that all Mudokons will die if Abe escapes. By breaking the fourth wall, this message communicates 2 points. First, it heralds proximity to the exit for first-time players. Second, it emotionally motivates them to try and find the other Mudokons, and by stating outright how many Mudokons there are, gives a clue that some are hidden away for players that didn't find any secrets. We are still at 25 Mudokons, so there is one last secret before we leave, its puzzle being deceptively difficult. The catch is that trapdoors lose collision not just when completely open, but also during their animation frames. This makes them highly unreliable, but by applying some movement arithmetic we see that hopping actually allows us to avoid them altogether, and coincides with good placement relative to the meat grinders, making the gauntlet solvable via a combination of patience and timing. The trapdoor that opens allows us to safely get back on track, but what's interesting here is that normally a drop of this height would be fatal, but the developers break their own rules occasionally in the interest of level design convenience. For experienced players, Oddysee is not a long game, but this is compensated by the density in level design already on full display in Zulag 1. Not only did it toe the fine line between introducing the mechanics and the game world on the one hand and maintaining the level layout somewhat natural looking on the other, but it also layered lots of secrets into it, so completionists might have to spend some time to find them all. For me, however, the most impressive is that the level design factors into its balance some highly specific information that has been as of yet withheld from the player, something I hope veterans among you notice and can appreciate. Personally, I think that Zulag 1 is both mechanically and stylistically a masterclass in level design of the same caliber as the famous Undead Burg from Dark Souls 1. However, in terms of pure nostalgia, nothing beats the area that comes next, which is definitely the one I find most memorable across all games I've ever played. The mood is much more different here, as the subdued, almost mournful soundtrack and the ambient sounds of crickets contrast with the rhythmical bassy grooves of the factory. Pairing that with small details like the no Mudokons sign do a good job of conveying we are somewhere we are not supposed to be. Just to reinforce how draconic Rupture Farm security is, the game also introduces motion sensors, and this particular scene is probably the one that most often comes to mind when I'm thinking about the game. We are also introduced to a Scrab with a lonely Mudokon in its enclosure. The Mudokon could have wandered there accidentally, of course, but given what we have seen so far, the implication seems to be that he was forced inside, either as punishment or just for cruelty's sake. The copious amounts of bones in all the enclosures imply both that this happened before and the general lack of care for all the wildlife trapped here. For a first-time player, the Mudokon will probably be mauled before they can react, demonstrating the Scrab's viciousness. When considering all the striking imagery used here, it's no wonder it overwhelms me with nostalgia and it's so memorable. The motion sensors, the red-eyed Glukkon statues looming in the distance, which were possibly inspired by the animated segment of Goodbye Blue Sky in the wall, and all the wire fences help build this dystopian Orwellian picture, as if rather in a concentration camp. This is no surprise, as the term Zulag itself is a corruption of Gulag, the prison camps of the Soviet Union. Not concentration camps per se, but a close relative. Silhouetting everything not only enhances the mood, but also maintains an air of mystery around the Scrabs, and allows for hinting at this place's violence less gruesomely. It's even used in the gameplay, such as by hiding the door to a secret area in plain sight. What makes this scene most memorable for me though is its juxtaposition with the open sky. Notably, barring the smog-filled sky in the opening shot of Rupture Farms, this is the first time we actually see the open sky in-game, an experience possibly shared with Abe himself, and the beautiful twilight colors reflect this by transitioning from the more familiar deep orange of Rupture Farms' interior to the fresh dark blue of a clear night sky. I feel this transition is meant to suggest the passage of time, but the effect is undermined by moving back and forth when clearing the secret area. This could, however, be considered an understandable concession to artistry versus realism. The only glaring flaw in this area is its secret. The goal is to lead two Mudokons through a long scrap chase, and I think the developers push the player's goodwill beyond what's reasonable. The challenge is needlessly protracted by only being able to talk to one Mudokon at a time, and designing an encounter around such technical limits of game mechanics breaks immersion. It's a shame because thought was clearly put into other aspects like maintaining aesthetic cohesion with the Stockyards with the orange hues, silhouettes and wire fences, and I also like the barricaded condemned doorways as they always add to the dilapidated state of Rupture Farms. At least the area allows the player to infer a few details about Scrabs ahead of their proper introduction, such as their agility. They are the only enemy in the game that is faster than Abe, so much so in fact that this secret would be borderline impossible if flipping screens didn't artificially add some distance between Abe and chasing enemies. At least occasionally, this combination of Scrab relentlessness and Abe's deliciousness can lead to amusing results. Because we are outside the factory, the absence of LED messages must be compensated for with another diegetic mechanism for instructing the player. Signs are still used, but as I outlined earlier, they only work for shorter messages. Hence a better solution, the fireflies, which are particularly clever because they can be injected into practically any scene at minimal cost in terms of game view real estate, without having to revise the geography, and can also be adjusted to display messages of arbitrary content and length. The Stockyards is not a long segment, but I find it very evocative and works as a good transition point towards the next area, officially called the Free Fire Zone. This is technically still part of the Stockyards, which you can confirm by checking out the name suggested for your save file when in that area, but I like to think about them as separate because they explore different themes. The landscape becomes less industrialized and really leans into its prison camp outskirts look, with haphazard barbed wire all over the place. One of my favorite details are the campfires because they add a bit of contrast even when not contributing to dynamic lighting directly, and with a bit more time could have even been integrated as a game mechanic. To match the dark ambience, the game also relies the most on stealth, kickstarted by this carefully crafted encounter. On the one hand, the Slig is sleeping and the fireflies warn the player to sneak in and out of shadows. On the other hand, forcing the player to hop over the mine wakes up the Slig, initiating the stealth section. What seemed strange to me though was the introduction of the second look for chance suppressors. The variant in the farms needs more disk space and puts more pressure on memory because it's properly animated, so it makes sense to replace it for Exodus, which is a much larger game, but I can say why Oddysee needed it. That said, this next area is a top contender for my most disliked one. I do like the idea of hiding a bird portal in the shadows, which can be accidentally found by scaring the birds away, but the area itself is not very well implemented. It's a stealth segment in keeping with the theme of the area, but the time the player might spend hanging from the platform can be so long as to strain believability about Abe's grip and upper body endurance. Ostensibly, the player is supposed to lead Mudokons away from the UXB and then hide in the shadowed pillar on the top platform, but flipping screens like this can be dangerous. I feel like the safer option is to just remain on the lower level in the second screen, as you can lead the Mudokons when both Sligs are off screen and hang from the platform to hide from the lower Slig. Synchronizing the Slig's patrols can take some time, but making noise can help by distracting the top Slig and resetting its patrol cycle. As a side note, Sligs are described in the manual as being receptive to GameSpeak. Sligs will greet Abe when he says hello and will make croaking and buzzing vocalization, allegedly distorted flamingo calls, as responses to other lines. To match their role as enemies, the emoting interactions are inverted compared to Mudokons. Sligs will laugh if Abe emotes anger and make a disgusted sound if Abe farts or laughs. Sligs, Mudokons and Glukkons, including Moloch, are all actually voiced by Lorne Lanning himself, which speaks volume about his range as a voice actor. To me, however, his performance as Abe in Oddysee specifically will always be the standout, and not just due to nostalgia. Especially as an adult, I can't help but notice that it drips with a genuine, if understated, sadness that isn't matched even by New and Tasty and Soulstorm, which are the closest to Oddysee tonally. I obviously cannot know what he was feeling at that time, but the Oddworld universe is effectively his beloved brainchild, and it's not unheard of for artists to pour their rawest, most unfiltered emotions into their first entry. Back to the game, we can now officially add enemy stupidity as a formal game mechanic. Granted, this is by no means out of character for Sligs, since Oddysee's manual also refers to them as having room temperature IQs, but in all honesty I don't think any of the enemies scripted to patrol would have registered the bomb and avoided it. What I'd like to highlight with this is that sometimes a bit of flavor text is all that's needed to hand-wave the shortcomings of enemy AI without compromising immersion too much. Ever so often, however, there are unexpected behaviors which are hard to explain as anything other than some kind of bug. What I think happened here is that Sligs are prompted to respond to GameSpeak commands with a small delay to emulate the timing of a realistic response, but when that happens, the Sligs commands are overridden to continue performing its current action until that delay elapses. The problem lies when the patrol boundary is right at the edge of a platform and the Slig's current action is walking. Not the most honorable exploit, but given the tedium of this secret, I'll take it. My dislike of this secret is further compounded by the next stealth sequence, which can be quite nerve-wracking and somewhat inconsistent. This depends on the approach, and the more tedious option, and the one I used in all my previous playthroughs, is to wait for both the Slig patrols to synchronize before running for the ledge, but the canonical option is to turn on the UXB and lure a Slig back to it. The issue with the second solution is that it can be somewhat inconsistent, with Abe getting gunned down immediately, which you might expect from some trigger-happy goon when seeing some moving shadows. While in isolation this tension is good, unfortunately it can also waste a lot of the player's time if they previously completed the secret, a debacle that could have been alleviated with some more relief checkpoints. On a more pleasant note, as the nighttime atmosphere settles in, the artists take full advantage of the alien landscape to give us beautiful night skyboxes with many gigantic moons and planets. Choosing different skyboxes for each scene breaks parallax, which I will describe in more detail shortly, but this can be forgiven in the interest of averting scenery monotony. Fittingly for such nocturnal scenes, we are also introduced to bats. I'd argue that bats might have had more potential, but in their current state they can be an irritating obstacle. On the one hand, their movement patterns are fixed for any particular scene, and they have no AI whatsoever, making them highly predictable on subsequent playthroughs. On the other hand, on any first encounter, their movement is highly irregular and unpredictable. When coupled with their lethality, which first-time players will no doubt find unfair, and their rather mundane design, it's no surprise they were replaced with the more dynamic and interesting Fleeches in Exodus. Their one-shot kills are especially egregious when used to pressure the player in unfortunate ways, such as when dropping down to this secret. Most players will likely hang from the ledge for a while as they observe the Slig's patrol, but the bat will close in on them as soon as the Slig returns, and likely before they had enough time to consider the situation. Bats can be killed by throwing rocks at them, but no puzzle in the game actually relies on this mechanic, and even then, not only is actually hitting them difficult, but they respawn upon leaving and revisiting the screen anyway. Since we're on the topic, not long after we are introduced to rocks, our second kind of throwables, which are primarily used to detonate explosives from a distance. As with all the other mechanics, we also get a secret area themed around them. One of my favorite details of the Free Fire zone is that both the rock sacks and the rocks themselves are not their usual brown color, but are instead this dark cyan to match the moonlit scenery. I will give a more in-depth breakdown of the lighting engine at a later point, but for now this goes to show the developers' dedication in circumventing the lack of true dynamic lighting, despite some shortcomings. One such limitation is not being able to more generally account for the dominant background color when tinting the rock. For example, in this secret area, rocks really should be tinted orange, but maintain their cyan coloring from the Free Fire zone. Before the next section, I'd like to express some thoughts about screen flipping, especially given how pivotal it was to the experience. This is regarded, rightfully so, as an archaism of game design that allowed for better graphical fidelity in the absence of real-time rendering. Oddysee's goal was to look as realistic as technology allowed at the time, so the developers opted for manually edited pre-rendered backgrounds with a fixed camera. One of the main issues going against the scrolling camera always centered on Abe is that it would have to account for the parallax I mentioned earlier, meaning that as Abe moved, all elements on screen would have to scroll along at the appropriate speed based on relative distance to the camera. This is an issue for 2D rendered games, as not only would multiple planes corresponding to each level of depth have to be carefully choreographed with independent scrolling, but it can risk looking unnatural anyway for any object requiring rotation or some other perspective readjustment. In the case of cinematic platformers, flip screens allowed for carefully crafted scenic backgrounds, and in the early days even became something of a stylistic staple of theirs. The only 2D exceptions I know of are Nosferatu on the Super Nintendo due to mostly being indoors, Limbo, which not only accounts for parallax to begin with but also uses its silhouetted style and blurring effects to mask any potential flaws, and Lester the Unlikely, which, innovatively, does none of those. Inside, Little Nightmares, New and Tasty, and Soulstorm are 3D rendered, so the engine naturally accounts for parallax. For Oddysee, however, flip screens were a good fit, with the developers even going the extra mile by using wipe transitions matching their direction to the player's movement. Certain visuals, such as the change in sky color I praised during the Stockyards escape, would have looked strange with a dynamic camera system, which is why New and Tasty omitted it entirely. Other advantages of screen flipping include giving the team some leeway to occasionally break visual coherence without making it too jarring, clarifying puzzle situations, and building up suspense when exploring a new screen with unknown threats. Frankly, for a game with as much quality and effort put into its painting-like backgrounds, I find discovering new ones to almost be a reward unto itself. From a video editing standpoint, it even helps with near seamless stitching of clips by joining them at transition points. In the final segment of this section, we have one more stealth area where we are given our first glimpse of the Mudokon moon in the background. However, the player is more likely to be focused on the patrolling Slig, and I'm actually curious how many players noticed it on their first playthrough, especially given that Abe canonically doesn't notice it yet. It wouldn't surprise me if this was done deliberately, as we have seen so far quite the artistry on the developer's part in crafting interesting set pieces. Part of what drew me into the world is that I always perceived a strong alignment between my own emotional state and what I expected Abe's to be in a given situation, which is what made the experience so memorable that I talk about it now 25 years after the fact. I'm sure everyone had their own unique experiences, and I hope some of you are willing to share their most vivid ones in the comments. The Fireflies tell us that we are almost home, but there is still one major segment to go. This final stretch is definitely a change of pace and comes with a formal introduction to an important fauna component. One of the most critical aspects about Oddysee is its music, and to me this particular encounter is the one that shines the brightest spotlight on the dynamic music engine. In the Ars Technica interview, Lorne Lanning mentioned that they fought against Sony's technical requirement at the time of allowing players to turn off the game music. I can't say I necessarily agree with reducing player options in terms of accessibility, but they do have a right to feel proud about the soundtrack of Oddysee, composed by Ellen Myers and produced by Josh Gabriel. This goes especially when paired with a dynamic music engine, as it does such an excellent job of matching the atmosphere and on-screen action. You have different tracks for calm, stealthy, and chase sequences, and also variations based on the type of the threat, and the tracks being both compositionally simple and identical in tempo makes transitions less jarring. In fact, it even seems like the game keeps an internal metronome to make sure all transitions happen on beat. Back to slogs, I like their simple but effective design, since a huge toothed maw on legs helps convey their aggression immediately. The relative banality of their barks and mannerisms like scratching integrates surprisingly well with their unusual design, and helps the player quickly infer slogs' role as attack dogs. It's no surprise then that the slog's name, another portmanteau, combines slug with dog, and the lexical connection with Sligs is not accidental. There is an attract mode video that encourages the player to lure the slog by throwing rocks at it, but I think most players will default to just speaking as their first guess. Slugs can be jumped over with correct timing, but it's a risky maneuver and probably not intentional given that at no point in the game does it actually require it. We have two more secret areas here, of course slug themed, where the tells are off-screen barks and falling debris. The secrets rather uniquely reveal each other by sharing one screen, and given that the second secret is easily discoverable, this seems deliberate. In its staging area, the first secret treats the player with another appearance of the Mudokon moon. This time, however, it's framed much more prominently, scenic even, and seems to have been included more as a treat for the enterprising player. I think there's no better way to close off the Free Fire zone than to point out that the black on blue, almost monochrome visuals, the silhouettes, haphazard constructions of stick and rope and strung up Mudokon corpses can be used to make a pretty compelling case that Limbo drew a lot of inspiration from Oddysee, particularly for its early sections. Given that Limbo thrives on its atmosphere, this would scarcely be a surprise for me. I particularly like the crucified Mudokon corpses as an environmental detail due to their efficiency in world building. Up until this point, there was a gradual escalation in displays of abuse, but while the presentation so far was already grim, its satirical elements primed over the more serious ones. Due to being a meatpacking plant, there was some plausible deniability about all the blood, at least if you don't take the Mudokon Pops reveal into the account. The Stockyards took a more somber tone, but were more focused on displaying the mistreatment of wildlife. However, nowhere until now are the displays of violence against Mudokons more blatant and grotesque than here, and these corpses are probably one of the most quietly horrifying scenes we will experience in the game. Not only do they show that Mudokons are constantly trying to escape, but also the consequences for failure. Moving then closer and closer to the foreground as the level progresses acts almost like a subtle visual escalation of the threat. While they might not act as a deterrent to the player, they are still likely to elicit disgust towards the practices of Glukkons and Sligs. Placing them in this nighttime section was also well considered on many fronts. It's more tasteful and helps avoid a harsher age restriction, as I imagine corpses in broad daylight would have made it much more difficult to just get the ESRB teen rating. It also helped artists create convincing imagery without overcommitting on details. Despite these depressing observations, the end of the first act is actually quite uplifting. Abe manages to finally escape and notices the Mudokon moon, which introduces some of the more mystical aspects of the game. Apparently, the original intent was to have a meteor shower create upon the moon in front of Abe's eyes, but this was cut due to budgetary constraints, for the better in my opinion. What elevates Oddysee's narrative as an escape story over those in literary or film format is that Abe's victory here is really the player's. Some criticize Oddysee's difficulty, but Abe's vulnerability is an important vehicle in communicating the danger of this situation, as well as the subsequent feeling of relief after overcoming obstacles, which ultimately makes this escape that much more gratifying.
I had just got past those slugs when the strangest thing I saw. A big moon was before me, and its face was my paw. Then I fell down a cliff. And smashed my head. When some big face appeared and said I was dead. Said our land was changing, was imbalanced at best. He told me my fate was to rescue the rest. For Paramites and Scrabs had been sacred once. But that was before Rupture Farms turned them into lunch. And they live in the temples, and that's where they still nest. And facing these creatures, that was my test.
We now enter the Monsaic Lines, where the atmosphere is gentler, the deep mossy green especially contrasting the dull greys in Rupture Farms. This shift in presentation is warranted as the Monsaic Lines are intended as a safe haven and tutorial reprisal area where obstacle difficulty is decompressed. Given the scarcity of technology, leather or fabric signs and touchstones become the prominent vehicle for communicating with the player. Unlike the directory palm print scanners, the touchstones called story stones in the manual focus appropriately on the Mudokons' lore, and this tonal change is even reflected in their literary style. Compared to the satirical slogans in Rupture Farms, the touchstones use rhyming riddles and wordplay with a sagely mystical tone to reflect Abe's rediscovery of his cultural heritage. Even the nature of their instructions is different, flavorfully exposing mechanics that Abe could not have learned about in the farms, such as being able to possess Sligs by chanting. Imagine having played this game close to its release date before widespread access to the internet. Imagine feeling helpless as you believe you have no innate offensive options and can only rely on the occasional traps or grenades. All of it because the developers deliberately withheld from you the knowledge about such a crucial game-changing mechanic until this point. Many years ago I read a YouTube comment by a person that had this exact experience and how they could restart the game and rescue all the Mudokons they previously thought they couldn't. If by some small chance this is you who are watching, please give yourself a shout out, but the salient point here is that this was no accident. The team went out of their way to conceal this mechanic, even omitting it in the manual and instead stating that revealing too much about GameSpeak is a spoiler. Much like how Abe's vulnerability is supposed to make the player feel oppressed, this revelation about Slig possession is narratively an incredibly empowering moment. What makes it stand out over other games that incrementally empower the player, however, is that the power was there all along. Reading about the game's development history reveals that this wasn't planned initially, as Abe was supposed to only be able to chant after having his stitches removed, but surprisingly it lines strongly with a theme explored in later titles. Specifically, it ties into how Glukkons have effectively erased the Mudokons' history, especially to prevent them from rediscovering their mystical abilities. This is one of the subtler plot points that can get lost on veterans that played Oddysee after or simultaneously with Exodus, including myself, which is why I found the placement of this tutorial so far into the game so unusual at first. We can now openly talk about possession as another mechanic that differentiates Oddysee from other cinematic platformers. Given the player's familiarity with Sligs, they already have some rough idea about their strengths and weaknesses. What Sligs gain in offense, their main draw being the gun, they lose in mobility, not being able to jump or hoist. Nonetheless, they can perform a wide array of actions, not all of which are used by the AI, such as operating lifts and pulling levers. The players can also beat Mudokons, even to death, though that does not serve any other purpose except as a means to exercise cruelty. Sligs have their own GameSpeak too, but we will delve into that as it becomes relevant. So far I have deliberately avoided possession as much as possible so I could recapture that feeling of discovery as best I could, but from this point on it's fair game. Another reason for avoiding possession so far was to illustrate the effort put into balancing the early levels around this gap in the player's knowledge. Veterans and observant viewers probably noticed that a lot of the Zulag 1 scenarios could be trivialized by possession, but exploring the game's alternative solutions was an enjoyable and refreshing challenge. Unfortunately, the game was not entirely consistent with this, as there were 2 secrets in the Free Fire zone that still required possession to complete, at least without using any exploits. We had already been for the first secret to detonate some mines, but that was actually the second visit. On our first we had to clean house a little bit. Uniquely, this is the only secret with 2 entrances, but this first entrance is by far the safer option for possessing the Slig on the top floor. Still, even if the player came from the other entrance first, they could still sneak their way past the Slig, then dash to the other side of the platform, though the timing can be quite strict. Both these secrets also put Sligs on the same levels as Mudokons, which can get killed in the crossfire if the player does not figure out how to tell them to duck. Requiring ahead of time knowledge of multiple mechanics that haven't yet been formally introduced is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it incentivizes replayability with more experience and knowledge. On the other, it may call into question the quality of the level design. In my view, a game like Oddysee should ideally give the players all the tools they need to perfect it on their first playthrough if they are observant enough. Playing devil's advocate, however, you could make the argument that the framing of these secrets is intended to nudge the players towards experimenting and discovering possession early, which can lead to a unique kind of satisfaction. Until we get to the next section, let's talk a bit about the Monsaic Lines aesthetics. The huge staff-holding Mudokon statues paint a much more dignified picture of them than what we have seen so far. I'm sure the statues were just obtained by upscaling and retexturing the models of characters and creatures, but given that the resolution of in-game sprites is rather low, it's a nice way to get more dividends from existing models and show off their finer details. While the architecture consists of stone and wood, the mosaic decor also involves metal in some capacity, with bells and curious sides above doors and in the grass. Combined with the sheer opulence of the statues, it suggests that Mudokons seem primitive in contrast with Glukkons, but they might otherwise not have been that far behind the technological curve had enslavement not stunted their development. The tribal aesthetic predominates though, and it is extended to even small details such as the falling rocks having rope bindings of deliberate traps rather than being random hazards. Despite the hostility from the slingshot Mudokons, the peacefulness and relative safety is conveyed through both its audio and visual design, which features a lot of birds, a fitting choice given their positive association with rescue portals. New and Tasty even neatly repurposes birds mechanically by having them heal Abe when chanting. Now, possession is an important mechanic, but even more relevant for the upcoming trials is understanding mobility capabilities, specifically toggling between running and rolling while in motion, and running up to doors and wells. Just like possession, these actions were available from the very beginning but weren't required by any particular puzzle. That said, I think the tutorial here is on the weaker side, leaving it up to the player to practice these maneuvers without any immediate gameplay incentive, which might have some players ignore or maybe misunderstand the point of this section. A better approach would have been a timed mini gauntlet, such as a timed lever-operated trapdoor, forcing the player to perform these maneuvers in a risk-free environment. There is also one particular flaw in the controls when switching from running to rolling. The action itself is achieved by simply tapping the correct key while running, X on the PC, but keeping the key pressed just a little bit longer than necessary will switch Abe to walking, which may no doubt lead to many frustrating deaths. While you get used to it, this could have been better implemented, for example by only registering the input on the initial press and then ignoring it until released. Monsaic also introduces wells as a new transportation mechanic. While very similar to doors, they are differentiated by being operable via switches that change the destination of Abe's landing. Unfortunately, the puzzle design around this mechanic is quite shallow. Most of the time, the main goal is to only make a well active, noticeable by all the leaves flying out of it so that it will lead to the correct path. The way they work physically is a mystery, and I reckon they are meant to be somehow similar to slides. Their portrayal in Oddysee, however, makes it clear that they are exclusively a native Mudokon form of transportation, a rule broken in Exodus, where wells are common in industrial areas. During well jumping, Abe is invulnerable, offering a nice breather during a tense chase. This invulnerability applies to the landing too, even when catapulted a long distance. Generally, well placement in Oddysee seems mindful to make this mechanical discrepancy less obvious. In Exodus, however, there is at least one instance where a well landing is survivable, whereas a normal drop in the same spot and from the same height is fatal, which is quite jarring once noticed. The slingshot Mudokons introduced the whistling mechanic as a simple Simon Says puzzle, which is a nice way to keep the players engaged with the gamespeak without slave Mudokons around. Overall, they are not that compelling of a mechanic, and what stands out about them is rather their blue coloration. There could be some lore-friendly speculation as to why, but as far as I can gather from the sprite data in the game files, the green Mudokon sprites are derived from Abe's regular sprites via color transformation, which it seems the developers simply forgot to apply to the slingshotter sprites. There are 2 points to corroborate this idea. One is that the sprites of the Mudokons in lotus positions are blue, despite clearly being green in the game, including their chanting sparkles. The second and more convincing argument, however, is how Mudokons are colorized to convey emotions in Exodus. We have seen a lot of meditating Mudokons from Monsaic, but only in inaccessible areas until this point. Making them reachable doesn't make them any more interactable, however, and you can even fart in their face with no response whatsoever. This might be grasping at straws, but having the natives be hostile or apathetic can also be perceived as a deliberate choice to demotivate the player from lingering in Monsaic. Mechanically, their only purpose is to act as distractions for the chasing bees, which adds a bit of humor and uniqueness to the Monsaic Lines. Speaking of, I consider bees better than bats because they actually have some rudimentary AI and are not instant deaths. In fact, they can be quite forgiving, given that they eventually give up the chase if avoided for long enough, even when failing to use the meditating Mudokons as distractions. The objective of the next set piece is to obtain a bell song, and the puzzle is laid out step by the map. The level of detail given in this map seems like false advertisement, since any future maps are not quite as informative. Maps are a nice way to capitalize on screen flipping, but I generally found them not that helpful because most levels have a natural progression anyway. I'd say New and Tasty does a better job at utilizing them by laying out their objectives, some enemy and door placements, and even subtly hinting at secret areas. The last method of transportation introduced here is persistent bird portals. Like fireflies, bird portals can be conveniently and efficiently introduced in almost any location without revising the pre-rendered backgrounds. Many secret areas are in fact only accessible via bird portals, an application which further illustrates their handiness in connecting disjoint areas without any geographical contrivances. A fun detail I didn't notice until recently is that you can actually visually distinguish rescue portals from persistent ones because the circle described by the birds also rotates around its vertical axis. Overall, the purpose of this small exercise is to familiarize the player with the bell song puzzle sequences, which will form one half of the many upcoming challenges. Upon finding the stone, Abe will remember the song and play it automatically upon possessing the clapper, which is quite convenient but comes at the cost of not allowing the player to open the door by manually playing the correct sequence. Having the player remember the bell song would have made for an interesting additional challenge on top of all the other pressures and would have even allowed them to brute force the solution had they not found the song. There are only 3 individual notes, and going by my assumption that the length of a note sequence is at most 7, the same note is not played more than thrice in a row, and that every note appears at least once but not more often than half the sequence length, rounded up, there are, according to my calculations, only 1,608 possible combinations, so having Abe remember the bell song and play it automatically is quite convenient. Bells are one of those mechanics that functionally is very simple, but all the added flavor does a lot to prop up their presentation. Even though manually playing songs cannot open doors, the fact that the developers allowed the player to play the bells anyway was a neat addition. This is helped by the visual effects around the chimes that use sparkles and radial screen tearing to create a synesthetic effect. The other half and the more critical goal of the upcoming trials involves lighting flintlocks, which are really just levers with the aesthetics of ceremonial fires as window dressing. Unfortunately, I can't pinpoint more concrete inspiration behind the flintlock's design beyond just its general association with mystical indigenous cultures, but if anyone has a good guess, please let me know in the comments. I think it's a shame Monsaic wasn't properly revisited more often in the series, since it would have been a good breeding ground for interesting set pieces. The spiraling pathways around the egg-like structures could have been pulled off marvelously in Soulstorm and would have contributed to a far more memorable introductory level than the bland brown canyon we see in the finished product. I'm pretty sure that if Soulstorm didn't state the location in the level's name, many veterans wouldn't have even caught on to the fact that that's where they are. Too many things are missing, including the huge Scrab and Paramite statues, which would have otherwise made for a nice throwback. At this point, the game offers the player a choice in whether they want to tackle either Scrabania or Paramonia first. The choice is more or less cosmetic, as it doesn't meaningfully impact the story's development, so it ultimately boils down to which creature the player is more curious about or less afraid of. We will go with Paramonia to maintain consistency in the cinematics and to align with the Japanese version of the game, which apparently shoehorns the player into Paramonia first anyway.
I had visions of Paramites living in the wild, how they were before I was a child. Then I saw what we did, ignored their cries, cut 'em up for Paramite pies.
We get dropped off in the middle of the Paramonian forest instead of the temple because the well tube has been damaged, which was a sensible and believable approach to introducing more outdoor areas, especially during daytime. Paramonia is generally the easier of the two areas, and that is already reflected in this first encounter. The intended solution seems to be to use the order bomb next to the Slig, a new type of toggleable mine which explodes after a set timer, but the absence of a security orb makes the encounter trivial by possession anyway. The important part here is rather summoning the Illum, one of the few harmless non-Mudokon entities in the entire game. Illum, which is just mule spelled backwards, is a quite unique piece of content that was sadly abandoned in all the sequels. In Exodus this was apparently due to disk limitations, but its absence in Soulstorm is quite puzzling. There is concept art of Abe riding Illum on twisted branches or roots, and Soulstorm has a lot of winding paths and open spaces in the so-called 2.9D environment, so it seemed like a match made in heaven. At any rate, I think it was a good decision to introduce a friendly companion, and while the bond between Illum and Abe is not emphasized narratively, little touches like being able to interact with it through GameSpeak may allow for a more direct bond with the player. Mechanically, riding the Illum does not give that much of a benefit, as Abe is just as fast and vulnerable as before. The only relevant advantage is the improved jumping distance, and wider gaps are strategically introduced to maintain a dependency on the Illum throughout this segment. Instead, the puzzles revolve around clearing the way for Illum, either by killing enemies on the path ahead, or more iconically, by getting it to stop binging on honey. In the Paramonian honey puzzle, all that's needed is throwing a rock at the beehive to topple it on top of poor Illum. I'm not sure how many players got stuck here on their first run, but the developers tried to give a few hints about what to do, such as the nearby engraving of Illum surrounded by bees. Another tell is suggesting the beehive could be interacted with somehow by conspicuously animating it, which is reminiscent of those old cartoons where you can tell some rock or plank of wood will be animated because it's colored differently from the painted backgrounds. What definitely got some players stuck on release though, in a potentially game-breaking way, is that wooden spike blocking the edge of the platform next to the honey, or rather its absence. Except for off-screen death pits, Abe won't die when falling when riding Illum, so if that spike wasn't there, Abe could ride off the edge, then reactivate an earlier checkpoint, but have no way to reach the top platform again, effectively stranding them and hardlocking the playthrough. While the more intuitive fix would be to add death animations, more pragmatic solutions are often preferred for products as difficult to build as software. This spike is one example of this, as it would have been much simpler to retrofit it onto the existing game without requiring any additional disk space. The fix would have consisted of overwriting only a couple of things: the background of the problematic screen and its corresponding collision matrix. If you're wondering why I mentioned them separately, it's because the visuals in the collision of any scene are not naturally correlated, unlike with what we're used to in our day-to-day lives. Instead, they must be coordinated between the level designers and the artists by making sure the static images carefully overlap with their respective collision information. This is made slightly more difficult by the grid system because the artists must also make sure to preemptively space out all the floors and walls in a way that can be superimposed on the fixed grid spaces. Poor alignment between them can lead to either invisible or collisionless walls and floors, of which fortunately there aren't any in Oddysee as far as I can tell. In this case, there are a few hints that the spike was grafted post-release. Namely, it visibly doesn't connect with the bottom of the screen and has no visual continuation in the scene below it, which reinforces my earlier point about the pros of screen flipping in obfuscating these discrepancies. That said, this makes me wonder whether simply adding a lever wouldn't have made for an even more elegant solution. Going back to more artistic concerns, I feel that aesthetically the forest is a welcome change of pace. This might seem surprising since Munch's Oddysee catches a lot of flack for its uninspired environments, some of which are forests, but the key difference is the context. For Oddysee, Paramonia, as perhaps the most mundane and Earth-like location, paradoxically makes it stand out. A rather unique aspect about it that I really enjoy is its apparent three-dimensionality, achieved through a couple of visual tricks. The more obvious one is the prominence of the temple in many of the backgrounds, which helps establish a spatial relationship between the player's current location and their destination, but the neater trick comes from the Illum tunnel transitions. We have already seen other transitions, but none involved 90-degree camera rotations, and what makes them stand out here is that previously visited areas feature in the new one's backgrounds, just from a different perspective. This is especially noticeable at the start with the Illum bell, and it really shows the effort on the developer's part in circumventing the limitations of the 2D engine and still achieving a sense of geographical continuity. This characteristic makes it plausible to me that the thought process behind Paramonia could have been the earliest prototype for the landscape design style later seen in Soulstorm. That said, Oddysee does inherit the disadvantages that come with juggling multiple static assets. During development, these may be subject to additional manual editing, and maintaining consistency between them can become increasingly difficult, especially as more and more considerations come into play, such as tweaks to level design. Aside from the infamous spike, the clearest example of this is probably the bee chase set piece, where the walkway is punctuated by many gaps, but when featured in the background of the following scenes, the walkway is continuous and all the support beams are missing. An aspect which is not a discrepancy, however, is that the walkway also curves, but the arc is quite wide and the segments observed at any given time by the player are sufficiently short such that it becomes unnoticeable. Somewhat related, a criticism that can be levied is that limiting the environments exclusively to narrow walkways, even for outdoor areas, is a pretty glaring gameplay contrivance. While this is completely correct, it's an idiosyncrasy of the Oddworld games and cinematic platformers in general I've grown to accept, much like screen flipping, so long as the best effort is made to help suspend disbelief via other means. For example, the extensive use of wooden scaffolding in this area helps justify this shortcoming to some degree. Speaking of the scaffolding, it is probably the clearest example of the parallax effect I mentioned earlier. Each floor really is parallel to the ground, but the ones closer to the horizontal edges of the screen seem angled more steeply, to such an extent that you can even see the underside of the platform towards the top edge. If the camera was scrolling, dynamically animating the floor's apparent rotation to preserve this effect would have been a veritably painstaking and inefficient process, so it made sense to rely on screen flipping and better allocate resources elsewhere. That isn't to say that no background elements are ever animated, and this is one aspect that Oddysee paid more attention to than Exodus. We have already seen meat barrels transported on conveyor belts in Rupture Farms, or the campfires and glistening stars in the Free Fire Zone, and in Paramonia too we have neat touches like the occasional spinning windmill. Still, there are a few technical criticisms that apply to this area in particular. While I generally like the presentation of the forest, it is probably the area that has aged the most visibly upon a closer, more technically minded inspection. For example, the cliff sides and some of the wooden structures show their age due to lower definition textures or coarser 3D modeling. When it comes to such minutiae, time and budget have as much of an impact as competence and resources, and in the case of Oddysee I'm leaning more towards the former as the primary issue more than the latter. In an individual scenario, the pre-rendered backgrounds could have been capitalized on even more with additional manual editing, to the point that they could have even looked photorealistic, while maintaining a minimal computational footprint. The biggest beneficiaries I'm thinking of are the trees and all the foliage. The existing backgrounds do a decent enough job already, but a dedicated team of artists with unlimited time could have expanded even more on how the vegetation looks. As is, there are a few issues which I admittedly didn't pay much attention to while playing and only stood out when reviewing the footage, but are really hard to unsee once spotted. Many of the trees are not actually derived from 3D models, but rather 2D images, often the same one, inserted into the 3D space, then roughly angled to face the camera. In real-life terms, the best analogy to describe this would be cardboard cutouts. This is by no means a revolutionary technique on Oddworld inhabitants' part, and really old games with 3D environments, but without the computational budget for 3D models, use this extensively. Classic titles most famously include Doom and its predecessor Wolfenstein 3D, where the lack of a 3D model was compensated for by using sprites. These were obtained by photographing real-life models such as clay statues or other objects from different angles, typically in 45-degree increments. In Oddysee's case, clay models were used as references to guide the 3D artists who then constructed digital models which were used by the animation team as a basis for the sprites. The animators then further manually edited the sprites using 2D animation techniques such as smears. Regarding the environments, however, despite the foregrounds and backgrounds being completely static, there are still points where tree or bushel images were not angled perpendicularly to the camera's perspective in the original render, giving them a noticeably squashed appearance. We are now preparing to close off the forest, and I betrayed the Illum by leading it into some mines. Not my finest moment, but what I wanted to demonstrate was that Illum has gibs, though it barely shows on the footage, which is not the case for all the creatures. Some of them, like Scrabs and Paramites, still die on contact with explosives, but they do not gib, so the level designers made sure to avoid intersecting them with explosives to hide this shortcoming. What I find most interesting about gibs and flying rock debris though is how they are used to further enhance the illusion of a 3D space. When generated, they are sent flying in randomized directions, and their movement on the z-axis is simulated by applying scaling transformation to their sprites, as if they moved towards or away from the screen. On rare but equally hilarious and grisly occasions, after Abe and Sligs get gypped, you can see their heads fly towards the screen in all their pixelated glory, and in some cases even bounce off of it, which was a completely unnecessary but funny detail to add. As we enter the Paramonian Temple, the game again makes a darker tonal shift. Before diving into the details, I'd like to point out a little trick in Oddworld games where they apply this colored fog effect to differentiate areas. The lighting in many locations can be quite natural, but for some areas it becomes more obviously stylized. I suppose if you tried hard enough you could concoct some possible reason for the greenish hue, but overall I think the designers were not so much focused on realism here as much as giving areas their own character, in this case by chromatically harmonizing with the forest. The visual themes translate coherently between the two areas, such as the scaffolding, but they take a much more ragged, even threatening look with the prevalence of spikes and spiderwebs. Outside there was one giant web foreshadowing the spider-like nature of paramites, but inside they become commonplace. In a stroke of environmental design genius, courtesy of Raymond Swanland, the webs are blended with all the ropes binding the scaffolding, creating a symmetry between the natural and artificial halves of the landscape that organically showcases the attunement of Paramonian Mudokons to their surroundings, and their imitative approach to integrating with the local fauna. Speaking of being in a cave, it's natural to see bats, and their glimmering red eyes peering out of hollows is yet another one of those details that makes Oddysee so lifelike. Some people have speculated that the eyes belong to the Sleeches from Soulstorm, which is a fun headcanon, but objectively highly unlikely. Fittingly, the lighting of Paramonian Temple is a colder green than Monsaic, almost mold-like, which effectively portrays it as dark, dank and rank throughout. This is complemented by the soundtrack with its echoing, cavernous soundscape and rhythmic dripping. I can only imagine if smells could have been conveyed through the technology available at the time, this area would have been a thoroughly noxious experience. We are now ready for the Paramonian trials, which are arranged in a format that will become quite common later, especially in Exodus, the level hub. The players can tackle the trials in any order, but using the map as guidance towards smaller levels first to get used to the regional mechanics is a viable strategy. Unfortunately though, a level's size is not the best yardstick, so a visual indication, for example by adorning trials with a number of Mudokon skulls proportional to difficulty, would have been a neat addition. Speaking of regional, it's about time we finally get to meet our first in-game paramites, easily identifiable by their ambient noise. That rhythmic clicking is one of those details I didn't consciously notice before, but given how unsettling it is, I have no doubt it contributed a lot to the feeling of tension and dread I felt while exploring this area as a child. Paramites are, bar none, my favorite creature design across all of Oddworld, and this is as good a time as any to praise Stephen Olds and Farzad Vararamian for their work on the concepts in Oddysee. A huge portion of the game's appeal comes from their bizarre but oddly believable creature design, and I find Paramites and Sligs to be the strongest representatives of this design philosophy on the natural and industrial sides respectively. While Paramites are the most unsettling design in Oddysee, they feel less threatening mechanically than the other predators due to not being immediately hostile. Instead, they only attack when cornered or in packs. While alone, they only follow Abe from a set distance in an almost cat-like manner. I also like how they gradually escalate displays of aggression when backed against a wall, much like a real animal. They start by only quietly flaring up at first and then intensifying vocalizations the closer Abe gets. As a whole, this dynamic between Abe and Paramites allows for more unique encounters when compared to other areas. Paramites supposedly lull the player into a false sense of security through their passivity, but blindly following one often leads to traps or ambushes. Overall, I find that their behavior does a good job of representing their species, as they are supposed to be quite cunning and social creatures. My only criticism is that when not engaging with Abe, they are too static and don't engage in any patrolling behavior, unlike Scrabs. Another trait of theirs is that they can be lured away by using meat, a throwable item exclusive to Paramonia. In this first trial, the native Mudokon gives Abe spirit rings with which to blow up all the mines in the area, but this requires whistling the password. The idea is to lure the Paramites away from the story stone, revealing said password by throwing some meat. However, I opted to instead show that whistling passwords, unlike bell songs, can be rather easily brute forced by applying some simple heuristics, such as by alternating the two whistles. Going back to the meat throwable, astute players will probably have noticed that visually is just a red variant of the rock sprite, but all the differences do a great job in making this less noticeable. In fact, it's quite impressive how all the throwables are distinct not only in terms of visuals and audio, with moist, squishy sounds in the case of meat, but also in terms of their physics. While rocks generally bounce and roll off the floor, meat chunks stick to it due to their plasticity, and grenades bounce more leadenly, complemented by louder thuds. A curious implementation details about throwables is how their type is tied to different areas, and this is best demonstrated when progressing to the second trial. I was still carrying some meat by the time I entered, but because this area features rocks as the designated throwable, the meat got magically swapped with a rock in my inventory. This illustrates how unaccounted for corner cases may give rise to unusual behaviors in software systems due to difficulty in anticipating all possible scenarios. A ham-fisted approach to preventing this, as used in New and Tasty, is to reset the throwable inventory upon entering a new area, but I actually prefer the persistent inventory system despite this oddity. It gels well with the openness of Oddysee, as unlike in Exodus, doors don't always close behind the player as they progress. If the player has issues tackling some trial, stocking up on throwables from a different trial beforehand can make a significant difference. The areas are, in essence, designed not to require this strategy, but just having that option adds a new, if minor, dimension to the gameplay. Keep this in mind, as it will actually be relevant in the next trial, but for now we have a minute to spare, so given that I mentioned QA earlier, I'll take this opportunity to point out some other useful glitches. For example, Scrabs can be killed by chanting right as they're about to jump over gaps, which can be useful in the Stockyards secret. Because Scrabs and Paramites stop and shriek while Abe is chanting, it's possible that this glitch has the same underlying cause as the glitch that causes Sligs to walk off ledges when using GameSpeak. Another exploit, the death delay glitch, can be triggered by timing specific frames in the hop animations with an explosion that would normally kill Abe. However, instead of dying, he will instead turn invulnerable to most hazards and invisible, though only to the player, not the enemies. The caveat is that any fall that would stagger Abe or just bumping into the wall would result in death. But the golden children of speedrunners are the auto-turn delay and stop-turn jump backwards glitches. Unlike the scrap glitch, these are less fun to explain, but the gist is that both exploit auto-turning when lowering from or hoisting up a ledge respectively while facing the wrong direction. This effectively queues up the hoist or lower command that was supposed to happen, but now the player can discharge it at a later point by turning in the right direction. The end result is that, when performed in the right places, Abe can either lower himself through the floor or jump through walls in such a way that allows him to bypass entire sections of the game. The dark side of glitches, however, involve R.E.L.I.V.E, which can sometimes disappear or simply not show up when loading a save, at least until dying. As with the forest spike I described earlier, the problem with R.E.L.I.V.E seems to be that glitches involving it risk hard locking the player, which can incite unnecessary frustration. Regardless, of these glitches, the only ones I discovered on my own were using GameSpeak to lead Sligs off cliffs, the inventory content, and one more which we will see later. The others are so arcane and hard to reproduce, except maybe the auto-turn delay glitch. I only became aware of them after looking them up for the purpose of making this video. Unfortunately, I have to say that this is a level of rigor in the QA process that Oddworld Inhabitants hasn't quite reached since. In our case, however, the carry-on glitch comes in handy for the third trial. As before, I was carrying a rock from the second trial, but this area features paramites, so the throwable becomes meat despite the absence of any meat sacks. I'm shooting from the hip, but it seems that areas flagged as containing paramites necessarily enforce additional constraints on the game state, including that throwables specifically be meat. The concept behind this trial is to simultaneously negotiate the pressure plate boulder traps entailing paramites, but the meat chunk makes it much easier to turn the traps against the paramites and kill them. For me, the robust theme makes this trial stand out as one of the more memorable ones, and I personally think that Paramonia generally has a very strong individual character compared to Scrabania, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Despite a good concept, there is one particular encounter which can be unforgiving. Climbing the ledge with a flintlock lever will trigger a couple of paramites to ambush from the ceiling, another unique trait of theirs that's good for testing reactions, but their placement is so far left that the player barely has a split second to decide to back off to the pressure plates, otherwise they get completely stranded and have to die or restart. Fortunately, we had some meat handy to create an opening and escape, but lacking that foresight might put the player in an awkward situation and create a feeling of unfairness. A concession comes with the scripting of the paramites, which is slightly relaxed by having the pack shriek when relatively close to the boulder traps, so there is a chance to pick them off. That concession seems less generous though when considering the second gotcha moment in this area. The boulder trap next to the door ledge is deviously synchronized with a running ledge grab so that the player gets killed if they come running in a panic from the right. While the execution could always use a bit more polish, all of these elements tie neatly into the characterization of the Paramonian Temple as a house of traps, having the largest assortment of them, at least in terms of unique assets. One of the standout features are the swinging spiked boulders, which are not seen in any of the other original titles until Soulstorm. I really like this trap due to its uniqueness if nothing else, but I can't deny its most obvious flaw, the fixed camera perspective. Because the boulders swing on the z-axis, it can be unintuitive to visually gauge exactly what is the safest time to clear them. The best bet for a new player is to observe the rhythm of the swings, which are completely irregular, and time their jumps when the boulder is expected to be furthest away from the center. Another option is to simply time rolls, since the gaps are narrow enough that Abe will grab onto the opposite edge. The second option, however, comes with the caveat that Abe can be killed if hoisting while a boulder swings as a result of his collision being briefly extended horizontally. New and Tasty did actually differentiate this trap from the one in the second trial by having the boulders in this area swing lower, such that they will kill Abe if he is hanging from the ledges, thus forcing the player to jump instead. From a purely level design perspective, this trial is not that remarkable beyond this trap, but this one always sticks in my mind, perhaps for an unintended reason. I think that I was pretty fair in both criticizing and praising Oddysee where appropriate. Because of that, I feel like I have to put an asterisk to one of my earlier compliments. You may recall that earlier I lauded the dynamic music engine, and I still mean it and can't overstate how blown away I was when first playing the game back in 1998. Oddysee and Exodus have the best dynamic music engines in the series, especially compared to New and Tasty and Soulstorm. However, like most things in life, it isn't flawless, and when it does fail, the results are interesting. If you recall, I mentioned an internal metronome before, and this bug is one of the reasons why I tend to believe that. That said, as far as bugs go, this one is definitely more graceful than some of the awful stuttering I heard in Soulstorm, which is pretty sad because some of Soulstorm's tracks are pretty good. On a more positive note, that gunshot sound is probably my favorite in the series, precisely because it's so visceral. Whenever I heard it, my adrenaline spiked knowing that some hungry beast was barreling towards me. Its effectiveness is also owed to its stridency compared to the rest of the soundtrack, and its absence from Exodus is one of those things that I sorely miss. Just to be clear, Exodus has its own variation on this track, but it's so subdued by comparison. Unfortunately though, its strong attack works against it whenever the music engine goes haywire like you just heard, because it can get grating quickly. Fortunately, this area is the only one I know of where this becomes an issue on a casual playthrough. Moving on, I have previously noted positively the relative openness of Oddysee compared to Exodus, but that it may come at the cost of unaccounted for corner cases. The fifth trial is the poster boy for the glitch with arguably the most impact on the gameplay, which is also the one I didn't disclose earlier in the commentary. At the start of the video, I mentioned that this playthrough will be one of roughly 101% completion, and it's precisely due to this trial, or more precisely, its secret area. Before we get into why that is, we can talk a bit about the secret itself, as there are a few interesting details. Notably, there is a checkpoint at the start, and considering the curveballs that will be thrown at the player, it's very much a welcome one. Naturally, the area features paramites, and is in fact the only occurrence of paramites in an industrial setting in the whole game. The challenge is leading Mudokons one by one to the portal and then backtracking to the platform while the paramites are eating, which might be quite nerve-wracking at first. Where it gets interesting is that the player will likely figure out what they have to do easily, but they will also have some doubts about whether they can do so in a timely manner. Here the player must have a little faith in the developers, who were almost certainly aware of this because they deliver. The meat-eating time window in this particular area has been manually tweaked to be much longer than in any other section, so much so in fact that if the required movement sequences are executed as quickly as possible, the paramites are still eating for half a second or so by the time the player gets back to safety. Of course, I mentioned the curveball earlier, that's because the developers couldn't help themselves. After rescuing all the Mudokons, a rapid-fire boulder trap got triggered right in front of the escape portal. The video shows a trick to bypass it completely, but it's highly unlikely the player will foresee this on their first go and may even get killed if they were chanting underneath the trap. Now back to the corner case, its ramifications are much less benign than turning a meat into a rock. As far as I can guess, it boils down to the implementation of a particular safeguard. The developers anticipated that preserving the exact state of a trial whenever it's left and later revisited could potentially make it unsolvable depending on the player's actions. So to avoid this, they opted to completely reset the state of the trial and all its entities upon exiting. Paramites, traps, everything gets reset, including the Mudokons in this secret area. Using this knowledge, I will reset this area to save one extra symbolic Mudokon, but there is theoretically no upper bound short of overflowing the counter to the number of rescues achievable via this method. For those who are not tech savvy, overflowing is a phenomenon that can happen in finite counters like computers. To best explain this, imagine you have a page with two squares, in each of which you can write one digit. Naturally, the largest number you can write on it, in decimal at least, would be 99. If somebody now asked you to add 2 to it, you wouldn't be able to write 101 with 2 squares, so if you start adding from the right, you would end up with 01 on the paper. If you had one more square, you would not only be able to write 101, but also effectively multiply by 10 the amount of numbers that you can write on it, and then by 10 more for every square you add. That's also what happens whenever computers try to add numbers in registers that are not large enough to fit them. The counter effectively rolls over. The difference is that instead of squares on papers, computers have bits, and instead of decimals they use binary, so for every bit you add to a register, you effectively double the number of values that can be represented by the register. At the time Oddysee was made, 32-bit architecture was the norm, so it's safe to say a 32-bit number was used to store the number of Mudokons saved. It's also very likely that the number is a signed integer, which sacrifices the most significant or leftmost bit to encode the sign, so that cuts it down to 31 bits. In this case, to overflow the escapees counter, a player simply has to save 2 to the power of 31 minus 1, or roughly 2 billion Mudokons. Without cheating and assuming you can do the trial in around 30 seconds, then it will only take around 2041 years to complete, give or take. I know I flew off the handle with the lecture there, but this is by far the largest trial across both Paramonia and Scrabania, and the puzzle situation is quite complex. This might also account for why Paramonia has fewer trials at 6 than Scrabania at 8. Its central puzzle is having the player make use of the rolling boulder trap to destroy the beehive guarding the bell song, but it's the flintlock encounter which I find the more onerous one. Once again, the developers spring a paramite on the player to box them in, giving hardly a second to react to the threat. But in a neat twist, the second half of the puzzle is a throwback to the Elum honey puzzle encountered earlier. In my case, I opted to kill both paramites, but the puzzle is still doable even if only the first paramite gets killed by the bees. The player can still lure the ambushing paramite to the far left end of the pit, and the lever is far enough to the right to be pulled without the paramite killing Abe. The only way for the player to really box themselves in is by jumping over the ambushing paramite without meat on them, in which case I would argue they brought it on themselves. An interesting thing worth mentioning is that the Paramite and Scrab encounters are structured slightly differently between Oddysee and Exodus. Specifically, whenever a Paramite or Scrab dies in Exodus, it's accompanied by the same jingle used when Mudokons die, so the game is subtly encouraging you to minimize wildlife casualties. Unlike with Mudokon casualties, this does not directly impact your karma system, and puzzles are designed such that, except for Scrab infighting, killing Scrabs and Paramites is not needed. Nonetheless, gratuitous murders of wildlife are clearly frowned upon, and that makes perfect sense considering their preservation is one of the major themes of the series. In Oddysee, however, especially as we see in this playthrough, killing either of these kinds of sacred animals is even necessary, and despite clashing with the narrative, it still makes some kind of sense, though more subtly. You have to keep in mind that these temples house rites of passage specifically designed to be lethal, so some casualties are expected one way or another. When also considering that Abe is less experienced and more likely to be scared, it would make sense for him to take more drastic actions in the interest of self-preservation. At this point, there is one trial left to go, and I don't necessarily have much to say about it, except that its main trap, the boulder on the upper level, is triggered by stepping next to the lever. Unlike the similar trap in the 5th trial, this one is not triggered by a pressure plate, and I think most people will notice this and expect it to trigger after pulling the lever, not as soon as they get close, an assumption that is fatal. I have some speculation about what the developers were intending to convey here, but if that holds, there are some issues with the execution. Next to the lever, there are some conspicuous rope bindings on the scaffolding, and my impression behind the intent was to convey that stepping on them springs the trap. However, that notion is challenged as even if hopping over those bindings, the trap still springs. I'm not sure whether those rope bindings were intentionally placed there, but the developers didn't account for how the player could avoid the trigger and instead haphazardly affixed an invisible trigger on the grid spot, or if they simply tried to pull a fast one on the player and those bindings are just a coincidence. I think the Stockyards are definitely the most memorable location in terms of atmosphere, but taken as a sum of its parts, Paramonia is probably my favorite overall. Some of that is purely subjective, simply because I prefer the pine green, but another thing I like about it is that it seems to have a stronger direction. I already outlined the broad strokes, but there are also subtle details such as how the doors resemble a Paramite's face. The planks of wood converge towards the bottom as fingers arranged in a similar formation would, and if that doesn't convince you, there are also rope bindings conveniently placed in locations that would correspond with knuckles. It's also fair to say that most areas convey character through an identifiable gameplay gimmick that makes them memorable and warrants some comment. I especially appreciate that they are still recognizable when removing industrialist obstacles, which logically should not have been a factor in the trial's design as conceived by ancient Mudokons. From this point, the number of introduced unique assets tends to drop significantly, and because of this, there will be some gameplay comments here and there where I feel it's appropriate, but they will become sparser as we proceed towards the second half of the game. However, this isn't strictly a negative, as it gives the breathing room to delve into topics even more extensively than before. The temple concludes with a foray into the nest of the endemic species, and it wouldn't be inaccurate to call the nest this game equivalent to a boss fight. Hopefully the player practiced their mobility enough by this point, otherwise they'll be in a heap of trouble. Unlike the previous areas, which could also be taken slowly, the nests require almost non-stop focus and in my view are by far the harshest ramp up in difficulty. The player is encouraged to carefully scout ahead by using the background plane, and this can allow them to safely memorize the layout and spot traps, but nonetheless I expect them to flounder at least once until committing the layout to muscle memory. In my view, these moments are the most climactic in the game, so I will let them speak for themselves.
The big face said I'd learned much throughout my quest. This handscar would help me, for more dangers await. I would need its full power to complete my fate.
The Paramonian Nest has always been a highlight of all my playthroughs due to its fast pace. In terms of design, it can serve both as an example and counterexample when describing the game as trial and error. To start with the latter, the trials should have already primed the player about Paramite ceiling ambushes, and sure enough you can even see them subtly moving on the ceiling through their idle animations, so you're expected to figure out where they are likely to occur. What can be described as both, however, is the trapdoor. Because it's a completely new asset, I expect most players got killed by it on their first run. However, it's an even elevation compared to the rest of the floor, and Paramonia's trap-heavy environment suggests that something is up. There is even a roundabout way to get spoiled about it by watching one of the Attract Mode videos. Regardless of how you frame this, Oddworld Inhabitants' old website justifies Abe surviving these ordeals because of his phenomenal intuition, which is an interesting way to integrate trial and error gameplay within the story. Intuition will definitely be a valuable resource because we are now headed to Scrabania, arguably the most challenging location in the game.
I had visions of Scrabs, safe in the wild. How they were before I was a child. Now they're cut, ground, and mashed into little cakes. Scrabs destroyed for profit's sake.
We have seen a plethora of Oddworld environments, industrial, tribal, and forestry, so it makes sense that Scrabania should feature its own unique landscape, a desert. Much like in Paramonia, the well tube that would have probably delivered Abe straight to the heart of the temple was damaged. This gives another opportunity to spend some time outdoors with many fun activities such as playing bocce ball with your Slig buddies. I think visually Scrabania aged better than Paramonia since the only vegetation found are cacti, which can be modeled as simpler geometric shapes and relatively cheaply compared to pine trees. Also, the fact that the environment features a warmer environmental lighting seems to help mask imperfections in the textures of rocky surfaces. The coloring might make Abe's cyan skin stick out in an unnatural way, so the developers slightly desaturated the blue in his sprites to better blend him in, to the point that to some people Abe seems green in this setting. The introductory segment of Scrabania is in many ways a mirrored version of the Paramonia one, beginning with an initial meetup with R.E.L.I.V.E, followed by a set of assorted puzzles, but I find Scrabania to be more challenging. Unlike Paramonia, which seems more inhabited and artificial due to all the scaffolding, the outskirts of Scrabania seem more natural. There is still some evidence of it having been populated. For example, there is this nice trap at the start where crosses etched into the ground give indication that a boulder is supposed to land at that spot when pulling the lever. The first lever is used to kill a Slig, which should clue the player about where to pull the second lever from to not die, another minor test of situational awareness. In an earlier segment I mentioned that I find Scrabania to have a bit less character than Paramonia, and I mean that from an experiential perspective. Naturally, this is a subjective assessment dependent on your sensibilities, but what leads me to believe this is that Scrabania features industrial assets more often in lieu of unique ones, specially designed for the area. This includes Sligs, mines, UXPs, and an asset we haven't encountered so far, the floating mines. It is possible to encounter floating mines as early as the Stockyards escape when triggering the alarms, but this is the first area where they are a prominent threat. Mechanically, floating mines are in many ways bats on steroids, given that they may fly in an arbitrary fashion across the screen and kill on contact, but there are a few differences. Mines often move much faster than bats, and their explosion radius requires that they are detonated from a safe distance. On the flip side, mines are programmed as objects with semi-persistent states, so once detonated by whatever means they will not respawn, unlike bats. I say semi-persistence because of their positioning, which for mines with cyclical movement is discarded when off-screen and reset to their initial value when a screen is reloaded. Keep this in mind, it will become a factor later. As explosives, they are also vulnerable to spirit rings, which gave a reason to add more native Mudokons to the area. In Paramonia, however, native Mudokons operated platforms, acting like a natural extension of the environment, whereas in Scrabania their function as spirit ring dispensers appears more as a gameplay concern. Visually, I find mine design in Oddysee to be more well considered than New and Tasty. To me, the design of New and Tasty's mines is simply more juvenile. The mines in the original have a very regular shape, as if they were designed by following the specifications of an engineer and built en masse via automation. This is especially notable with regards to their pegs, which are called Hertz horns for real naval mines and trigger the detonation when damaged by an incoming ship. In Oddysee, they are relatively evenly distributed on their top and bottom hemispheres. In New and Tasty, however, their distribution seems more haphazard, and some horns have been replaced with spikes, which, when coupled with the Mudokon skull decal, gives the impression of an edgy teenager spin on the original design. Another aspect is their movement. Mines in Oddysee have mostly regular movement and only rotate around their central axis, which I would imagine is meant to break the Hertz horns when colliding with lighter, thinner obstacles like, say, Mudokons. In New and Tasty, however, they float as if on the surface of rippling water, which makes some sense given that they are modeled after naval mines, but this display of buoyancy clashes with their clearly metallic and therefore dense exterior. To illustrate this cognitive dissonance, just imagine a beach ball made of steel and how bouncy that would be. Granted, the fact that these mines float at all is unrealistic in either game, but their more controlled movement in Oddysee makes it seem as more a product of engineering. I admit I'm also partial to the sounds they produce in the original, where the rhythmic humming is synchronized with their axis rotation, suggesting their flotation might be caused by some oscillating internal mechanism. All of these are of course nitpicks, but to me the grounded if boring aesthetic in the original makes the mine seem a colder, more deliberate obstacle, the kind that would have been engineered and approved by a committee of humorless, powerful people whose only concern is efficient killing, and one that could easily fit into a book about historical explosives in a way that the new design simply wouldn't. Back to Scrabania itself, part of the increased challenge is the replacement of more forgiving obstacles like bees with less compromising alternatives like floating mines. However, while it is more challenging, I'd argue it is less memorable, and I think this is best expressed in how it manages the tension between what I would call experiential and compositional design. To sum up these terms that I just made up, a game with compositional design establishes a concrete set of base mechanics and assets which it then combines to increasing levels of intricacy throughout its runtime. By comparison, a game with experiential design instead focuses on grouping cohesive elements and then distributing them such that each stage results in a distinct experience or conveys a certain mood. Distinguishing these paradigms does not necessarily imply a value judgment, i.e. one being better than the other. Rather, it reduces the discussion to a matter of application. For example, constructive games like Minecraft function best with heavily compositional design, whereas an experiential approach is better suited for games driven by their story or atmosphere. Each of these offer their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, compositional games offer both the player and developers more freedom because their mechanics can be used as building blocks to creatively express ideas or challenge the player in unique ways, but may have some trouble with translating that into an experience that doesn't feel somewhat procedural. Whereas experiential games may be better at actually delivering an emotional impact, but may sometimes constrict the player to the point of feeling railroaded, and the developers may have to account for ways in which the players might go off script. These two elements need not to be mutually exclusive, and genres where progression is not a factor, like fighting games, do not really exhibit either. In the case of cinematic platformers, they are often at their best when they offer both, but favor the experiential paradigm. However, even titles in this niche subgenre can be expressed on a spectrum, and the best examples for each are the parents of the subgenre no less, Prince of Persia and Another World. Prince of Persia features a distinctly small set of assets. Guards, spikes, guillotines, health potions, and a very constrained set of potential environments, which it then combines to varying degrees. Unexpectedly, sometimes such combinations can rebound from compositional back into experiential territory and result in interesting set pieces. For example, heavily abusing collapsing floor tiles creates a tense, crumbling castle-style gauntlet in level 10. However, Prince of Persia does feel more gamey than organic for the most part, which is a typical symptom of compositional games. Nevertheless, it also has experiential pivot points with special encounters, such as a unique reanimated skeleton in level 3 or Jafar's magic mirror in level 4. Another World, on the other hand, leans very heavily on experiential design, which is particularly impressive since it was developed by a single person. It features a lot of one-off wildlife encounters, the armored tank segment, a swimming section, and many others, each one requiring different ways of thinking. Nevertheless, it still has some compositional elements, such as the gunfights, but even those have the occasional twists and turns. A notable example involves aiming the gun at an alien without shooting in a mock hostage situation. This dichotomy is applicable for recent titles too, for example when comparing Soulstorm with Little Nightmares 2, which are compositional and experiential respectively. A way to gauge where a game falls on this spectrum is to ask yourself, how well would the existing in-game assets translate to a level editor? Oddysee has a small but surprisingly vibrant modding community who design their own levels with varying degrees of challenge, and they do reuse assets from all over the game, but one of the common pain points is that, aesthetically at least, combining assets plucked out from different areas can create jarring imagery. So far, Oddysee leaned more on the experience, gradually introducing new mechanics and tailoring encounters around them, both in terms of level and artistic design. As is typically the case, Oddysee then relies on more compositionality as the player progresses and becomes familiarized with the fundamental mechanics. Escalating the challenge is a good way to keep the player engaged in the moment, and the more compositional design of Scrabania introduces a bigger need to scout ahead and stimulates long-term planning. The issue is that the area suffers from a distinct lack of other unique assets, as we have already interacted with Scraps previously, though only briefly and not to their full potential, and there are no new traps or environmental interactions. This is not to say that the area is not fun, visually distinct, or evocative in its own way, but I also couldn't help but notice this absence of unique mechanics, which is what led me to this conclusion. If you're curious what a cinematic platformer of the same technological age as Oddysee would look like if the developers took the time to customize every area with fresh assets, check out Heart of Darkness, which William Anderson, who was involved with game design, mentions as an inspiration during Oddysee's development. Its presentation resembles Oddysee in many ways, but experiential design is cranked up to 11, and even as a child, while I liked Oddworld more, I couldn't help but notice how unique almost every part of that game is. There are some recurring elements, but most levels have unique assets, which is not surprising considering Another World's creator was heavily involved in its development. The price for such an approach is twofold though. Heart of Darkness is significantly shorter than Oddysee at about half its runtime, despite having been in development for 4 more years, from 1992 until 1998, disregarding other factors like manpower and budget. Furthermore, because assets have little staying power, encounters are mostly fresh throughout the runtime, but some obstacles or concepts don't get enough breathing room to be used to their full potential. All of these comments may make it seem that I might not enjoy Scrabania on its own merits, but that is actually not the case. The game established enough foundational mechanics on top of which to build really good levels. What I wanted to highlight is that the game is not even close to asset saturation relative to its given runtime, so a few more unique obstacles would have been welcome. Since we're on this topic, 2 other loosely defined metrics which can be used to taxonomize games are complexity and depth. Unlike the previous terms, these actually have an established meaning, and my understanding of them is as follows. Complexity is the number of distinct informational elements in a game in the form of basic assets and rules, whereas depth is the space of possible interactions that can emerge from said elements. A fun, if a bit tenuous analogy to use here would be chemistry, where you can think of complexity as the number of basic elements in the periodic table as well as the basic rules for which elements can bind, for example through ionic or covalent bonds. Depth would then be the number of configurations that atoms can be arranged in using these basic rules to form compounds like molecules. Sometimes these are directly correlated, as more functional elements logically allow for the design of more interactions, but it's not a given. For almost polar opposite examples, a game like Go has a lot of depth in terms of strategies that can emerge from a really simple rule set. You place stones on the board, and connected groups of stones that are encircled by the enemy are captured. You could say that easy to learn and hard to master games tend to fall in this category. In contrast, card-based drinking games like Kings have a lot of rules, where each card may describe a different action players must perform when drawn, but typically there isn't much interplay between them or strategies that carry on between hands. In other words, remembering all the rules can be a chore, but the solutions to the challenges imposed by the game are very simple. This does not necessarily mean that a game cannot embody both traits or neither. In the former game, you can place RPGs, immersive sims, fighting games, or anything used for esports like RTS-based games. In the latter, you can fit simple pen and paper games like tic-tac-toe or hangman. I can't say these notions of depth and complexity cleanly map onto the previous traits of experiential and compositional design, but there is some overlap. Games that have a higher potential for compositionality can open themselves up to more depth. For example, Minecraft and Factorio are Turing complete, meaning you can technically emulate any other computer game or even program in them, which is perhaps one of the highest claims to depth a game can possibly have. Meanwhile, experiential games might introduce and discard mechanics depending on the mood or themes they want to explore, or simply to keep things fresh and novel. A good example of this is the aforementioned Little Nightmares 2, where some chapters introduce a local mechanic, such as the flashlight that freezes the creepy mannequins in Chapter 3, or teleporting through TVs in Chapter 4. This somewhat increases complexity because it forces the player to learn and get used to new mechanics, therefore somewhat changing the rules. However, it doesn't necessarily create depth because these mechanics never overlap across the game's runtime to create unique scenarios. Where cinematic platformers generally fall in terms of depth and complexity can be a matter of some debate, but a common element is that they often use a simple control scheme, which may have wildly different impact on the gameplay. Prince of Persia does not have a particularly high level of complexity due to a simple control scheme and its limited assets, and depth is not that elevated either, as you can typically negotiate obstacles individually, but every so often there are situations where you have to carefully inspect the environment and plan a movement sequence ahead of time to progress safely. In comparison to it, the physics-based mechanics of Limbo are also quite simple, but they may be twisted in intricate ways, with a gradual integration of previous puzzle elements into later ones, especially in its secret area. Where cinematic platformers can be most unique though is when input actions change depending on context. This recycling of inputs creates an interesting trade-off. It minimizes complexity in the control set at the cost of potential depth, as each context essentially becomes its own minigame, another world probably being the best example of this. In this sense, Oddysee and Exodus are a departure from the typical cinematic platformer paradigm, as they feature by far the most complex input scheme, especially when factoring in GameSpeak, with a staggering 19 keys being used at least on PC versus the 5 or so used by the other titles I mentioned. This is even ignoring context-dependent interactions, such as how the up key can be used for either hoisting, touching story stones, and mounting Elam, or how commands may change for different possessed creatures. You also have a lot of different mechanics, including parkour, GameSpeak, possession, and stealth, and despite my earlier complaints about Scrabania, a variety of assets that is still hard to match, especially by a lot of these older titles. As outlined when discussing compositionality, these mechanics and assets can be combined in highly intricate ways, which is where I think the depth of the gameplay is. Keep in mind that this is achieved with only 4 AI-driven enemies: Sligs, Slogs, Paramites, and Scraps, most of which do not even overlap in their encounters, whereas all other threats are environmental. To be perfectly fair, each of these 4 enemies has such a rich set of behaviors and interactions that they would be practically equivalent to 3 or more individual enemy designs in other titles. You could argue that some of their traits overlap, such as how Paramites, Scraps, and Slogs all act as melee chasers, but this overlap in function relative to their full behavioral set is much smaller than other games, especially where reskins of the same enemy with different stats are common. That said, the checkpoint system does place Oddysee in a chokehold when it comes to the depth of its level design. A lot of people really like Exodus because it introduces the quick saves, and I do have a lot to say about it later, but for now, quick saves allow the developer to stretch the game mechanics to their limit. When looking at some puzzles in Exodus, it's clear that the checkpoint system would have been unfair, so migrating to quick saves was a wise move. A good example to illustrate this tension between checkpoints and harshness in level design can be found right as we enter the Scrabanian Temple in the secret area. First off, I am not fond of how this area is hidden, because unlike those in the Stockyards or Rupture Farms, this one has basically no tells. Nevertheless, it constructs a unique sequence by combining stealth and UXBs. This first half is tense but short, which unfortunately cannot be said about the slog shootout that follows. To make matters worse, the player must then make it through a Sligs sniper segment to get to the temple hub. Both the secret and main path challenge are fine on their own, but the lack of a checkpoint between them means one small mistake with the snipers can result in having to do the secret all over again. This wouldn't be a problem if the secret was shorter, but as it is, it just feels like another instance where the developers don't respect the player's time. Just a side note, a difference between the PC and PS1 versions is that on PC, checkpoints are marked by the floating green diamond you might have occasionally noticed on the footage, and you will also see points where I deliberately gamed the checkpoint system to avoid losing progress. On the PS1 version, however, checkpoints are completely transparent from a UI standpoint. This is kind of interesting, as the checkpoint markers were criticized quite harshly in Matthewmatosis' popular video on New and Tasty. Admittedly, the approach used on the PC release of the original is much more subdued than in the remake, perhaps even too much, because its meaning may not be entirely obvious at a glance. Still, as much as I agree with many points in Matthewmatosis' video, some of his criticisms when comparing to the original were perhaps a bit harsher than warranted. Anyway, despite my less favorable observations about the more compositional design of Scrabania's gameplay, from an artistic perspective it is just as strong as the previous areas. In Exodus, the equivalent areas for Paramonia and Scrabania are respectively the Mudomo and Mudanchi burial vaults, belonging to two distinct Mudokon tribes. Those names likely didn't exist at the time Oddysee was developed, so New and Tasty took the opportunity to retrofit them as the tribes formerly inhabiting Paramonia and Scrabania as well. This is shown through a couple of achievements and by reusing the Scrab and Paramite symbols found in Exodus for Ape's tattoos. I always found it interesting how the artists connected aspects of the animal's behavior with the culture of each area. The Mudomo tribe is less explored, but we have seen that Paramonia has many traps, which gels well with the sneaky and ambushing behavior of Paramites. The Mudanchi, on the other hand, are explicitly stated to be a warrior culture, which makes sense given Scrab behavior. We have previously seen Scrabs in the Stockyards, but by limiting their appearance, the level designers kept their cards close to their chest regarding some of the more interesting aspects of their behavior until it was their turn to be the star of the show. Socially, Scrabs are the inverse of Paramites. Where Paramites are relatively docile when alone and aggressive in packs, Scrabs are instead hyper-aggressive lone predators and even prioritize engaging in duels to the death over chasing Abe. In typical Oddworld fashion, even this behavior is scripted in remarkable detail, where the Scrabs will first take appropriate distance and acknowledge each other with a howl before fighting, giving their duels a markedly ritualistic, dare I say, gentlemanly feel. When killing Mudokons, Scrabs will charge, then tap dance on the corpse to shred the meat, and follow that up by performing a distinct eating animation. But when fighting, they have a highly frenzied battle and do not engage in cannibalism afterwards. All these traits not only make them seem more honorable, or as honorable as a murderous animal can be, but also suggest that their fights are not driven by sustenance. Rather, it is a deadly process of sexual selection, which was confirmed by the creators in extended lore by stating that, at the time of Oddysee and Exodus, it was their mating season. I always found Scrabs to be the most intimidating enemy, mostly because of their speed and stature, but also because a few Scrabs are especially scripted to be in an agitated state by having them charge back and forth in their patrol area. I suspect one of the reasons for this is to reduce waiting for opportune moments to proceed, but it also serves as a small bit of characterization to reinforce their aggression and that they might also be in heat. From an environmental perspective, a difference between Scrabania and Paramonia is that the overabundance of webs in the latter conveyed quite strongly that Paramites ultimately had ownership over the land. Because Scrabs do not secrete any substance, however, conveying their presence in the area is trickier. To compensate, the walls are littered with hollows that are filled with straw bedding, implying this is how Scrabs organize their nests, which makes sense given their bird-like beaks. To further cement the theme of symbiosis between natives and wildlife, some of the nesting spots look deliberately constructed by Mudokons, much like how people today have birdhouses in their backyards, although in this case it will be closer to housing a terror bird. Having seen the entire fauna lineup in the game at this point, I now feel okay raving some more about the fantastic creature design. One aspect I always found fascinating is that despite the creatures clearly being modeled digitally, they always seemed closer in style to practical effect monsters from the 80s. Oddysee creatures have a unique style of their own, which I will dissect shortly, but there is an undeniable sense that they borrow some inspiration from movies like Predator, The Thing, and The Fly. Perhaps the most obvious inspiration, however, are creatures in the animated scenes in the Wall movie, specifically from the trial, and perhaps even more obviously Alien, courtesy of H.R. Giger's Necronom series of paintings. My main argument for this is that Scrabs, Paramites, and Slogs are all eyeless, which has always been a simple but surefire way to ensure your monsters are creepier. Where I think the style is unique, however, is the way their biology is communicated. Paramite is a portmanteau between parasite and mite, despite them not resembling either, and Scrab etymology is obviously derived from crab. Apparently, and probably incidentally, it is also a Northern Irish term for scratch. Either way, when adding the slug component of slogs into the mix, the allusion is clearly to invertebrate animals. In the case of Paramites and Scrabs, their physiologies, as their names suggest, also display traits that are commonly associated with arthropods, which is also reflected in their movements. When analyzed closely, however, they are much closer to mammals in many ways. Notably, they are clearly vertebrate and endoskeletal, and the way their musculature is structured is quite human-like, especially for Scrabs, which are ripped like a bodybuilder. As a funny side note, I can understand why Scrabs have that cheese grater six-pack to support the weight of their torso and heads, but those massive pecs do look silly considering they have no arms. While both animals are hairless, neither have scales like reptiles nor shiny skin to suggest that they are covered in mucus like amphibians, which makes it seem as though human skin is probably the closest in terms of texture to theirs. On the other hand, their fingerless, vaguely arthropod limbs are arranged in a more radial manner as opposed to bilateral. Their limbs and paramite mouth fingers nonetheless end in sharp nails that look keratinous rather than chitinous. All in all, the combination between arthropod and vertebrate traits is so seamless that I'd argue it makes for a unique style I haven't quite seen anywhere else, except perhaps the Predator's iconic ugly motherfucker mandibles. The closest comparison I can think of is Half-Life, specifically designs like the Vortigons and the Bull Squid, but that couldn't have been an influence since both titles were released roughly at the same time. There is even variety within this style itself though, since the Illum and Slog are more distinctly dinosauroid given their digitigrade posture. I think Illum leans closer to a Star Wars inspired design, specifically the Town, and is deliberately made to look a bit dopey to endear it to the player. Slogs, on the other hand, are closer to a Jurassic Park design, combined with the Langoliers from Stephen King's eponymous novella. One aspect about the Slogs I have to criticize though is their hip placement in relation to their body. Even as a child, it always seemed to me that Slogs would have a hard time keeping their balance while running because their legs are so far back while their enormous heads lunge forwards. This would probably not have been an issue had their tails been longer, given that real-life dinosaurs like the famous T-Rex are similarly heavyset and bipedal and use their tails for balance. Making their tails longer would have probably been enough, but I think an elegant solution would have been to move their legs a bit forward and somehow convey that the legs were in fact repurposed front legs and that their original hind legs were vestigial and fused into short tails. I took the liberty of drawing a rough sketch of what that could have looked like just to illustrate my point. This would create a physiological through line with Glukkons and Sligs, whose legs are also vestigial and in the Sligs case fused into tails. Despite all of this, I think the team ultimately lived up to the 6 commandments guiding the design of Oddworld as outlined by Farzad Vararamian. These are that all images must be realistic, have solidity, be original, be cool, evoke emotion, and look alive. As a footnote, the game engine that the game is built in is called R.E.L.I.V.E, so that last one was more of a pun on their part. There is a community effort to rebuild the game's engine called R.E.L.I.V.E in the hopes of making the game more easy to run on modern operating systems. If you're interested, you can find the open source repository on GitHub. I will put links in the description. Another important aspect of Scrabanian aesthetic is the architecture, which is remarkably different from both Paramonia and Monsaic. I have pointed out earlier that Monsaic exhibited several construction elements like woodwork, masonry, and a bit of metallurgy, while Paramonia features almost exclusively woodwork and some crude stone constructions, but in either case the overall style seemed more tribal. By contrast, the Scrabanian Temple distinguishes itself both from the inside and the outside through its much more regular architecture. The temple itself is a gigantic stone cylinder which would have probably required some serious civil engineering knowledge to build, lack of realism due to its size notwithstanding. Its insides are also more sophisticated and feature lots of stone pillars and cylindrical constructions with intricate engravings. Since I am not a historian, I hope not to overstep my expertise here, but if I were to hazard a guess, the most likely inspiration for the Scrabanian style would probably be a blend between ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and African. Scrabania features more liberal use of metal, as it can be generally seen dotting the environment via certain spherical outcrops. Where it's especially noticeable is in the hanging apparatuses of flintlocks and bells, and the trapdoors, which are different from their Monsaic and Paramonia equivalents. Perhaps even more interestingly, there are various stones hanging from cables throughout the environment, and the cables themselves look like chains coated in tar or vulcanized rubber. Given the historical era that Scrabania is meant to model, this is quite anachronistic, as even in human history, vulcanized rubber is a relatively modern discovery from the 19th century. I will concede that modeling chains would have been quite time-consuming for relatively little payoff, but on the off chance that this was a deliberate stylistic choice, it suggests that Scrabania was more scientifically developed than the other Mudokon tribes. On the other hand, Scrabania is very much in line with Paramonia in terms of how they, for example, use wind energy. In the desert, there is what for the longest time I thought was the remains of an orrery, an astronomical device used to model and predict the movement of celestial objects. In reality, however, this is what is called a bladder, some kind of inflatable device that seems the equivalent of the Paramonian windmill. The official artwork nonetheless acknowledges the bladder's support beams are made from steel. This is highly speculative, but connecting these developments with Scrabanian Mudokons' reputations as warriors might explain the higher concentration of industrialists in Scrabania. Strategically, it would make more sense to attack the most developed and problematic tribes first. Alternatively, Paramonia would have likely been much less vulnerable to outside incursion due to its labyrinthine nature and all the traps. In all likelihood, the presence of more industrialists here was rather a gameplay concern, both as an attempt to escalate the challenge and because there was probably not enough time to implement more unique obstacles, but it's nonetheless an interesting hypothesis. The only thing I would have liked to see more of would be more varied, stylized representations of Scrabs and Paramites, not just the petroglyphs and the high-fidelity statues. Some cross-pollination with Scrab representations in Paramonia and vice versa would have also helped bind the two areas diplomatically. At the end of the day though, I think the natural and native environments in Oddysee were a triumphant success. Since we are on the topic, however, let's talk about meeches, an often overlooked detail. Meeches are mentioned in the introduction as being extinct, and it is widely known in the community that they were essentially cut content. Repurposing them as extinct animals just to showcase the consequences of industrialist exploitation and to hammer home the environmentalist message was a clever move. However, AMAs with Lorne Lanning have confirmed that had there been more time and disk space, meeches would have had their own temple, which would have been located in a jungle, and that all 3 tattoos from each temple would actually combine into a single one, like a jigsaw puzzle. As a side note, that makes me wonder whether any of these assets were recycled for the Necrom jungle in Exodus. Lanning also mentioned that the first decent game footage he has seen of Oddysee was Abe being chased by a pack of meeches. There are, however, a few indications that meeches were probably not very far into the development process before they got cut, and my reasoning is as follows. The Monsaic Lines are essentially a hub to the other temples, and they feature Scrab and Paramite statues, but no meeches. Given that the statues are upscaled models and the meech concept art exists, if the meech model would have been refined enough, I think they should have had statues in Monsaic as well. Demon Soul's famous 6th Archstone proves that including some vestigial elements of cut content may spark intrigue, even if they don't ultimately contribute to gameplay. In the case of meeches, some statues and a destroyed or otherwise inaccessible well to the Meech Temple would have helped so much in world building by directly showing the consequences of the industrialists' rampage across Mudokon and wildlife habitats. As it is now, however, it makes Meeches seem forgotten, even in the natural world. In terms of gameplay, I admit that it wouldn't be easy to devise what the niche of Meeches could have been. Paramites and Scrabs practically form a closed set in terms of intraspecies behavior, where Paramites are highly social, whereas Scrabs are highly antisocial, so Meeches would have to distinguish themselves through other traits. One proposal I have would be allowing Meeches to chase Abe vertically, much like Fleeches in Exodus, which incidentally have a very similar name. They could do so by jumping, given that there's enough room, or by scaling trees or vines. This would challenge the player's at this point ingrained belief that ledge grabbing is a surefire way to safety from chasing parties. My other suggestion, however, and probably the more interesting one, would be having Meeches be aggressive while alone, but prioritize some social behavior when in pairs, like engaging in courtship dances. Introducing a third wheel Meech would spoil the party until an additional fourth Meech would be found to rebalance the equation, and so on. To generalize, safety would be predicated on whether the number of Meeches is even or odd. I admit this might overlap with Scrabs, but combining it with the vertical climbing trait would have given the opportunity for some interesting level design where the player had to devise the optimal path that distracted Meeches in such a way that trial objectives become accessible. We have 2 more trials before the Nest, and these last 2 are noteworthy because they have secret areas, which will also be the last unique secrets in the game. The secret in Trial 7 is quite well hidden, and it's also memorable because it's incredibly annoying if you don't know a very specific trick. I think most secrets so far have been solvable by using mechanics as they were intended and didn't necessarily require much exploitation of implementation details, but this one in particular sucks a lot without it. Why, do you ask? That's why. It may not seem like it, but the timing to clear that mine is entirely too stringent. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that floating mines have semi-persistent state with regards to positioning, and that is highly useful information in this case. It took me a while to remember, but to clear the mine when climbing, all you need is to keep up pressed when coming from the screen below, and the mine will always be repositioned such that you can hoist safely. The only reason you have to do that though is because of screen flipping in one of the rare instances where it is used against the player. Realistically, Abe should be able to open the bird portal and save the Mudokon here without going to the mine platform, and I can't honestly refrain from repeating myself that relying on implementation limitations is generally not a good take on level design. Speaking of quirks, there's a noticeable cropping error on the screen before the secret. You can imagine the process of animating 2D games as stacking several images on top of each other to form a single frame, which are then rendered at high frequencies, around 30 frames per second for Oddysee, like a film reel. The ordering of these images is important, so the furthest element, typically the background, must be at the bottom of said stack so that it's rendered first. This is followed by the characters and then the foreground. Oddysee also has a background plane which would require some additional layering. The likely cause of the error is that after Oddysee's backgrounds were obtained by taking snapshots of 3D scenery, an artist had to inspect the images and then manually crop and save what they deemed as foreground, which would have been a very tedious process. This technique is reasonably extensive as demonstrated by Oddysee's multiple planes, but it has its limits. An example of this would be drawing an individual object such that it is partially in front of and partially behind another object, such as 2 characters hugging. In this case, the simpler approach would be to either swap both character sprites with a set of shared sprites that were drawn beforehand, with arms and torsos interlocked. The less ideal approach would be to split both characters into multiple sprites and then carefully and tediously layer all of these sprite components on top of each other for each animation frame. By inspecting the sprite data, it's clear that the first technique was indeed preferable because single sprites are how they approached rendering Scrabs locked in death dances. As with the temple entrance, this secret is not hidden as nicely as some of the earlier ones. In Zulag 1, the Stockyards and the Free Fire Zone secret placement has been interesting, using shadows, audio cues, environmental hints, or simply tucking them away from the beaten path. The Paramonia secret is not that good, but the ramp of the rolling boulder does create a visual point of interest. The problem with these last 2, however, is that they may only be found by attempting to walk through specific walls, but there is barely any indication of a tunnel, so many players wanting to save all the Mudokons will have a hard time finding them. Here, New and Tasty actually has an advantage because the 3D rendering and camera movements may allow a small peek towards the tunnels that observant players may pick up on. Fortunately, that is not the case for the last secret, which is also the most telegraphed one. After escaping the agitated Scrab at the start of the level, we have a rare Scrab ambush by way of a mysteriously rising platform. Unlike Paramites, Scrabs cannot innately ambush, so the devs had to make use of another mechanic to make it happen, but they capitalized on this further by also having the platform lead to the last secret, and that arrow pointing down makes it painfully obvious. The secret itself is not that interesting, given that it's merely a rehash of the Stockyards secrets, so all the same criticism apply to it just as well. We still have some time until the Scrabanian Nest, so I'd like to summarize my impression of the trials here. If you are also watching the footage, you may have noticed that the trials here are noticeably shorter than Paramonia, but they are also much more hectic. They put more emphasis on timing runs into wells and using them for evasion, like in the previous two trials. Scrab chases are always intense, but the game gives the player a few tools they can use, such as playing the chase music when a Scrab is barreling towards Abe from off-screen. The short length of the trials is also appreciated because very small mistakes can lead to death and cost the player a lot of time, so to compensate for my previous checkpoint criticism, I actually commend the developers for spreading them out and allowing the players more checkpoints here. To conclude, I'll point out that while Scrabania as an area is less mechanically developed than Paramonia, Scrabs themselves seem to have had more work put into their animations. I always found the way they moved to just be so hypnotic to look at, incredibly fluid and lifelike, especially their running animation. The fact that they patrol areas and howl occasionally is also more natural than the Paramite's stiffness whenever Abe is not around. I think adding a few idle animations to the Paramites, like how Slogs occasionally bark and scratch, could have gone a long way to alleviate that. Interestingly, Abe also has some cut idle animations, like rubbing his eyes, yawning and stretching, and you can still find all the sprites in the game files. I don't know why they were ultimately removed, but I'll make a few guesses. One would be that if the player would have to suddenly move, locking Abe into an animation would be deadly in a high-stakes situation. Alternatively, allowing him to suddenly snap into movement would not look good, especially compared to the quality of existing animations. The second reason I can think of are the stealth sequences, especially those involving the motion sensors. Having the alarm triggered by an unprompted idle animation would be incredibly frustrating. Alternatively, making the animation not trigger the sensor would ruin suspension of disbelief on the player's part. In either case, there could have been solutions to this. For example, the game could register what's on screen and simply flip a flag to disable these idle animations if any of these criteria are met. This is something we know the game already does, as demonstrated by how it directs the dynamic music engine. Unless Oddysee had a serious case of spaghetti code, I imagine hooking into this system and repurposing it this way wouldn't have taken much effort. In fact, this system could have laid the groundwork for other improvements. One good use case for this would be by improving Abe's expressivity, where he could adopt a stiffer pose in areas with motion sensors, or a fearful pose whenever a slog is on screen. Most surprisingly, it's Lester the Unlikely, the worst cinematic platformer ever made, that approximates this by changing the main character's posture from slouching to straighter halfway through the game. With all the Scrabanian trials complete, we may now head to the Scrabanian Nest. As with the Paramonian Nest, the Scrabanian one allows the player to scout ahead from the background, but given our growing experience and the recovery of my muscle memory throughout this playthrough, we will dive straight into it.
My test was completed. I expected to rest, Then the big face revealed the intent of my quest. With two scars together, on the back of each hand, they could shut down ruptured farms and restore the lost land. With hand scars complete, the spirits took form. Now my chant had power. Ruptured farms should be warned. Yeah.
Like Paramonia, the Scrabanian Nest is a fittingly climactic closer, and completing the second trial gives Abe the power of the Shrikle. This is a Mudokon deity that looks like an amalgamation between a Scrab and a Paramite, further emphasizing the spiritual connection between Mudokons and their worshipped animals. Ascribing spiritual properties to living beings, natural phenomena, or objects is in the real world a primitive form of religion known as animism. In the case of Oddworld, however, these spiritual aspects are factual, not just cultural superstitions. The second act rekindled Abe's relationship with his background, and the powers he gains paint a clearer picture about why the Glukkons engaged in this over-the-top cultural genocide. As is par for the course with many stories contrasting naturalistic and industrialized lifestyles, proponents of the latter are presented as unambiguously antagonistic. That said, while Oddysee leans heavily into its environmentalist message, it does not sanitize the harshly uncompromising Darwinian nature of the natural factions as much. There is some nuance here, as industrialist encroachment has heightened both the aggression of wildlife and the prejudice of free Mudokons against factory-born ones. Nevertheless, Mudokons worship the clearly predatory Scrabs and Paramites, whereas the herbivorous Illum is relegated to being just a beast of burden. It's also important to note that these trials existed before the Glukkons, and as we could see are incredibly dangerous even by rites of passage standards. This juxtaposition between how rampant, irresponsible, profit-driven industrialization leads to pollution and a separation from and lack of respect for nature, and how nature itself and primitive societies can nonetheless be very cruel on their own, is in my view more honest. We shouldn't forget that at least a subset of the scientific development we might take for granted today massively improves the safety and quality of life of countless people and deserves a similar amount of respect, so it ultimately boils down to its application. Fortunately, Rupture Farms deserves no such concessions, so having awakened the power of the Shrikle, we will now head back and blow it up as the third act. On our way back, we revisit the Free Fire Zone, but in reverse. Asset reuse is a practical way to reduce development efforts at the cost of accusations of cutting corners or padding the runtime, especially when it's so blatant, but in Oddysee's case it was successful. One key reason is that, while the level layout is the same, the obstacles have changed in a way that makes sense narratively. The player already saw the initial level of security, and it being amped up to such an extreme effectively communicates the increasing paranoia of the Glukkons. This completely inverts the player's perspective on the power dynamics. Now they are the threat and the industrialists are on the defensive. The reason why this is especially great compared to other titles is because Abe is mechanically unchanged and just as vulnerable. Rather, the change is in the player, who gained a lot of experience and presumably confidence, which is subtly reinforced in-game by changing Abe's laughter to be more enthusiastic. By riding the high of having just annihilated a screen full of enemies with the Shrikle, the expectation is that the player's resolve has been reinvigorated. Another key reason is that the new obstacle placement forces the player to go through areas that weren't mandatory to explore during the escape. The enterprising player might then ask themselves what was in these areas on their first go, allowing them to discover a lot of secrets on subsequent playthroughs. While this area plays out, I would like to explore the graphics a bit more, specifically the lighting engine and the tricks used to work around the absence of real-time rendering. I have already noted some limitations, for example that campfires do not really emit light to the surroundings, but this also applies to sparkles produced by chanting, electric fields, open bird portals or explosions. To trick the eye that they produce light, the game does the following instead. First, while these particle effects are still sprites, they are very bright compared to the dark environments. And second, the entire screen flashes pure white during high luminosity events like explosions. This entire screen flash technique is also used in other ways. For example, when triggering alarms, the screen is overlaid with a semi-transparent red mask, and good use of transparency is one of the reasons why the graphics hold up so well even today. To better explain this, it's good to lay out some fundamentals. When looking at a game sprite, let's say Abe's, you perceive the boundaries of Abe's body to coincide with his outline, but in reality the image is a rectangle. Back when color representation was more primitive, a common technique was to decide on a specific color, like black, magenta or cyan, on top of which to draw all the sprites. During rendering, the desired sprite frame was copied from the sprite sheet as a rectangle and pasted on the game view, but all background colored pixels would be ignored, effectively turning transparent. This technique is the video game equivalent to using a green screen, and across all media is known as chroma keying. However, it presents three major problems. For one, the color designated as the chroma key cannot be used in any of the sprites for anything other than the background, since it would be ignored by the renderer. Second, the edges of the sprites are not guaranteed to blend nicely with other background colors, so sprites either had to use a lot of solid colors without too much detail and different enough from the scenery to stand out, or were given a black outline such that they would translate well to more or less any background, but inadvertently turn the art style more cartoonish. You can see the differences in the approaches when comparing Prince of Persia 1 and 2 on the MS-DOS. Lastly, colors cannot be blended to represent semi-transparent objects such as colored glass panels, and some games, like Flashback, work their way around this by making specular reflection part of the image itself while maintaining non-reflective areas fully transparent. Fortunately, better transparency options were developed over time. Many modern image formats use for each pixel an additional alpha channel alongside the red, green and blue channels, which is used to govern opacity. While it's hard for me to say whether this is the encoding used by PS1 sprites, Oddysee nonetheless uses transparency, where sprites have fully transparent backgrounds instead of a chroma key and reduced opacity around the outlines so that they may blend in with any background, which is particularly noticeable for particle effects. Transparency is also used to simulate shading by associating each grid position with a shading index to dictate how obscured characters' position there should be. Regardless of implementation, to understand the effect, imagine that all the sprites are masked with identically shaped copies that are pure black, and the opacity of the mask is modulated to darken the image. When a character moves, the shading mask smoothly shifts its opacity between its old and new position by linearly interpolating the corresponding shading index values across the duration of the movement. Linear interpolation, also called R.E.L.I.V.E, is a very useful technique to programmatically model smooth transitions. You are probably looking at R.E.L.I.V.E whenever you see UI elements slide between 2 points, for example. The transformation is called linear because the object's speed is constant. Positions are more intuitive to understand, but it can also be applied to opacity, given that it's a numeric value. Do note, however, that this shading index is purely visual and does not directly correlate with stealth. Abe is visible to enemies when standing outside the shadow, even if fully shaded, so stealth is governed by a different variable. At any rate, while they operated well within the confines of their engine, this graphical style does come with its own set of potential difficulties. For example, if an area looks dark but the developers forgot to adjust its shading index, the end result would be a very bright sprite standing in the middle of a shadow. Also, remember how I praised the nighttime coloring of rocks during the escape? Well, the rock sacks match the moonlit scenery, but unlike Abe, who is already bluish, Slogs and Sligs are still clearly their natural colors. Had they undergone a similar color transformation, they would have looked much better for it. Overall, Oddysee relies mostly on sprites, but there are a scant few applications of dynamic drawing as well. These include the circles of spirit rings, the beams of motion detectors, only the red triangle, not the fuzzy bar which is still sprite-based, and the zaps produced by the Shrikle and security orbs. In the former two cases, you have simple semi-transparent colored shapes. As for the lightning zaps, they are obtained by tracing a line with randomized curved joints from the source to the destination, along which a bright line is drawn. Unfortunately, on PC at least, Shrikle lightning sometimes leaves artifacts on the screen which only disappear once another object moves on top of them. The culprit could be a likely optimization that prevents re-rendering of screen tiles without animated assets, but it seems the engine couldn't keep up with all the lightning flying around and failed to do the proper cleanup. At any rate, because the distances between the points these effects are anchored around are relative, sprites, which have fixed sizes, would have been impractical, so the devs used a different technique known as vector graphics. This technique boils down to rendering polygons derived from mathematical specifications, much like in 3D rendering, except on a plane. These polygons are then translated to pixelated images in real time in a process known as rasterization, so that they may be rendered by the display. If you want to contrast the two approaches, consider Odysee's granddaddy, Another World, which uses pure vector graphics. As always, there are pros and cons, and in this case the advantages are that vector graphics smoothly scale to practically infinite resolution and result in a pleasant cel-shaded look. The downsides are a larger computational cost, and that the more details an image needs, the more tedious it would be for the artist to draw and animate. While we were talking about graphics, we had a pivotal moment in the narrative, the return to Zulag 1. Our re-entry into Rupture Farms was through a seemingly completely new area, but it doesn't take long to realize we are finally in the area behind the electric fence we saw during the escape with the petroglyphs. We are also greeted by the first non-secret Mudokon in quite a long while, and the game takes care to remind the player that the main objective is still their rescue. On the former escape route, the player will find the elevator has been removed, nudging them to backtrack. However, it still allows the player to stock up on grenades, which will be very useful shortly. As soon as they go back to the packaging platform, however, they get charged by a slug, pushing them away from the forwards path. While the player doesn't need to revisit all of Zulag 1 to proceed, forcing them to backtrack this way is a good choice, as they will see several new Mudokons, which encourages them to re-explore Zulag 1 and save them all. Any secret areas the player discovered during their escape will also be repopulated, though with somewhat more complex puzzles, which is an economical way to cram as many Mudokons as they can in the limited space. As opposed to the first run, the player is now expected to use Slig Possession to clear all the obstacles, and to make things more interesting, the player is introduced to more advanced Slig mechanics. One of them is the ability to command slogs, an intuitive process since it works very similarly to communication between Abe and Mudokons. Slogs can be ordered to follow the Slig around or attack targets. This is mostly handy for killing Sligs behind crawl spaces due to their short stature, or for getting the drop on Sligs guarding lower platforms, though the mechanic is not used that often. Sligs can also tell Mudokons to look out, so that Sligs behind them may be safely shot. My only complaint here is that Mudokons only hit the deck for a few seconds despite continuous fire, which is quite boneheaded if in character on their part. This can be a problem because Sligs don't collapse immediately when shot, but can be continuously riddled with bullets until torn to pieces, possibly a Robocop reference, and a feature I was sad to see removed in Exodus. To that end, it's best to space single shots when multiple Sligs and ducking Mudokons are involved. Shooting as a mechanic is more nuanced than it initially seems, given that keeping the finger on the trigger will cause the Slig to backstep from the recoil every 10 shots. This mechanic comes into play with slog kennels, where the player should stop shooting at regular intervals such that they don't get pushed off screen. A less known mechanic, however, is that the backstep can be performed deliberately by attempting to move in the opposite direction while shooting. This might seem inconsequential, but it allows the player to drop and shoot in either direction, which, for a game like Oddysee where every frame counts, can be practical depending on enemy placement. The final gameplay feature for Sligs are the voice locks, but those are just a rehash of the whistling puzzles, so are not that interesting. At this point in the video, we have pretty much exhausted all the topics regarding gameplay, so I will instead switch to expressing a personal opinion, namely that Oddysee is the best title in the R.E.L.I.V.E lineup, and that between Oddysee and Exodus, Oddworld inhabitants seem to have captured lightning in a bottle in a way they haven't quite managed since. To argue this point, I will compare every other Oddworld title excluding Stranger's Wrath, which is too different from these other ones, from the worst to the best contenders. It should come as no surprise then that Munch's Oddysee is the first in line, and many people agree it's probably the worst Oddworld title, terrible handheld ports excluded. Munch may be good on its own merits to some people, but it's undeniable that the transition to 3D was not handled well. To me, however, the worst offense is its cartoonish atmosphere, both in gameplay and art style, that undermines the themes, grit, and world building of both Oddysee and Exodus. Next up we have New and Tasty, with which I have already made scarce comparisons so far, and since extensive criticism already exists, I will only briefly mention a few points here. New and Tasty makes a few welcome extensions, such as crawling, which is a natural movement Abe could perform realistically, and improves throwing, but did so at the cost of arbitrary changes to the control scheme. The greater flaw, though, is loosening the grid-based system with more subdivisions to emulate continuous positions. This is not unheard of even for cinematic platformers. Another World, Heart of Darkness, Limbo, and Inside are prominent successful examples, and some, such as Prince of Persia, use a soft grid system as a middle ground, where positioning is essentially pixel perfect, but some actions, like jumping from a ledge, snap the character onto the grid. The issue is that slight misalignments with the grid can cause the player to run or jump into traps, and New and Tasty opted to instead rely on quick saves as a crutch rather than reimagine the obstacles around this. Third on the list, we have Soulstorm. It might surprise some of you to see it above New and Tasty, but I actually give it some extra credit for at least trying something different. On the surface, it looks like a return to form for the narrative and presentation, but suffers a lot from its technical execution, and I don't mean just a laundry list of bugs. To start off with some positives. The ideas the story wants to tackle are interesting. Having everyone think Abe's existence is just a conspiracy theory invented by Moloch for an insurance scam sure is a fun and topical spin on the old narrative, and I also like how the Mudokon dependency on Soulstorm Brew is that much grimmer than in Exodus. For those missing the context, in Exodus, of which Soulstorm is a remake, the brew creates an addiction that puts the Mudokons through harsh withdrawal. This allows Glukkons to convince Mudokons to work under the false promise of more brew. In Soulstorm, on the other hand, Mudokons are given the brew to drink all their lives from the time they are born. However, they are not told that quitting it will kill them in 2 days' time, which is an insurance policy against potential fugitives. Moving on, a second quality is that the cinematics are at their most beautiful and expressive yet, and some environmental designs can be very good. Old areas like Slig Barracks and Necrum Mines translated especially well to 3D, and some new areas like Fat Station are also visually interesting. Finally, some gameplay changes are natural extensions that improve both realism and dynamism, my favorite being vision cones for Sligs. I also admit to being apprehensive about the inventory at first, but it's not an unheard of system for a cinematic platformer. Besides Odyssee's limited inventory, Soulstorm is closer to Flashback and Blackthorn. Crafting is also polarizing, but it has grown on me because the selection of craftable items give a variety to encounter approaches far exceeding the originals without compromising immersion too much. My only complaint with crafting is that there aren't that many meaningful crafting decisions. That said, Soulstorm also has many drawbacks. The story ideas proposed are nice, but they are not actually integrated well with the plot. Unlike Oddysee, the standard for writing quality has increased dramatically for games, so I hope Oddworld can keep up. For example, the severity of the brew problem is not given due respect by the ease with which its antidote is obtained. Second, unlike the cinematics, the in-game cutscenes are very stiff, awkward, and worst of all, unskippable. The overall presentation is not helped by the incredibly poor audio implementation, with inconsistent sound volume and audible stuttering caused by the dynamic music engine compared to the seamless transition in Oddysee. Another disappointment was breaking the no HUD convention, and while the HUD can be turned off, it's clear the game was not intended to be played this way, as this creates severe information gaps when instructing the player. But probably most of all, my biggest disappointment is the baffling addition of double jumping, ostensibly introduced to give the players more clutch moments. But this was so immersion breaking it's harder to suspend disbelief than in any other title except Munch. The worst part is that they could have eaten their cake and had it too by justifying it through the game world somehow. We know Mudokons have evolved from birds, so they could have leaned into this and given Abe a more avian design, such as feathered arms, perhaps through some mid-game transformation. This could have been paired with the unlocking of other interesting flight-based maneuvers like gliding, which could have organically given ample opportunities for these desired clutch moments. To top it all off, even in the enhanced edition, I had to fiddle with the Windows registry to make the game run at all. All of these impressions ultimately made Soulstorm a very patchy experience with only the glimpse of a good game underneath. But now we move on to the most controversial comparison, with Exodus. Statistically, Exodus is considered the best in the lineup, so I'm sure most of you already disagree that Oddysee is better, and I completely understand, having thought that myself previously. However, re-evaluating the two games with a fresh mindset changed my opinion, and I hope you'll hear me out. Let's start with some positives in Exodus's favor, which is still by many metrics a phenomenal sequel. Technically, it addresses many limitations in Oddysee, such as by allowing players to talk to multiple Mudokons. It also does away with poorly balanced or somewhat repetitive mechanics like bats or whistling and replaces them with more dynamic ones like Mudokon emotional states and fleeches, or extends existing mechanics like possession. On the PC, it also improves control responsiveness. From an artistic and world-building standpoint, Exodus features a diverse lineup of industrial areas, of which Fico Depot, Slig Barracks and Boneworks reflect the more atmospheric design elements from Zulag 1. That said, outside of those three areas, environmental design lags behind Oddysee, and natural environments were hit the hardest. Only Necrum Jungle throughout its short runtime recaptures some of the superb natural scenery from the original, whereas the Exodus counterparts to Scrabania and Paramonia, the Mudanchi and Mudomo vaults, seem uninspired, formulaic rethreads with little consideration given to geography. This is exacerbated by an issue with pacing, as Exodus simply feels too long, especially Soulstorm Brewery, which gets stale quickly. I feel the designers were aware of this, but their only solution was to periodically change the color of the backgrounds. I would have much preferred a shorter game that extends good existing gameplay features like the Illum or introduces more wildlife like the Meeches to the superfluous length of Exodus, quality over quantity. The tone also takes a bit of a hit, and downscaling the original seriousness in the interest of turning Abe into a mascot was a mistake. This is somewhat understandable, as Oddworld inhabitants got pressured into it by publishers, and Exodus is still a darker game than most. Nevertheless, it feels like some of the poor balancing between the serious and comedic elements that plagued Munch start to show up here. But the addition which may have been the most detrimental is the quicksave, which I deliberately omitted as an improvement. Quicksaves undoubtedly have their benefits. They allow for sophisticated gauntlets that would otherwise feel unfair, but the main issue is that they weaken the tension by dramatically reducing the stakes of any given encounter, detaching the player from that important feeling of vulnerability. While knowing the player will abuse quicksaves allowed level designers to go ham, stretching the mechanics to their limits in a good way, the end result is that many puzzles are difficult to execute but don't contribute so much to the atmosphere. Recall that compositional versus experiential design paradigms I proposed earlier. Writing the script gave me a reasonable middle ground idea by replacing quicksaves with an in-universe meditate action, where Abe takes the lotus position like the Mudokons in Monsaic Lines and chants for a second. This style of choose your checkpoint mechanic could have been more interesting because it can now be balanced properly, for example through security orbs. Players would also have to factor in the animation required to perform it, which could take some time and potentially cost some Mudokons their lives. Other interesting ways to extend this would be, for example, using different chanting pitches between meditating and possession. Security orbs could then be attuned to different frequencies to target either kind of chanting, such that in some areas you can possess and not quicksave, while in others it's the other way around. This can be supplemented with the addition of a noise mechanic. For example, a security orb may be distracted or overloaded by asking the other Mudokons to chant in your stead. The reason why I'm making such a proposal is that generally I dislike the idea of using the main menu as a gameplay mechanic. This is less of an issue on PC, as Exodus allows quick saving and quick loading with F5 and F6 respectively. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about consoles. My suggestion would effectively allow the developers to roll together the best elements of both Oddysee and Exodus without the main menu as a vector. As things stand, Exodus feels undoubtedly more fun to play, but its success seems more of a consequence of the solid foundation provided by Oddysee, and regardless, the important point is how each game stacks up against the stated goals. Is the experience meant to be fun, or to send a message? Weighing all of these things, I feel that Oddysee, for all its flaws, is more effective at driving a meaningful experience that extends beyond the gameplay, which is what ultimately led me to the opinion I have now. Back to the game itself, we are about to wrap up Zulag 1 again and head to Zulag 2. Mechanically, my only comment is that overall I always associated the return to Rupture Farms with an unmistakable sense of relief compared to the temples. Artistically though, I hate to start off on a bad note, but Zulag 2 is definitely my least favorite area in terms of aesthetics because the orange coloring doesn't help it stand out that much compared to Zulag 1. In general, the remaining Zulags do not really deviate that much from the established style, and the only way to distinguish them is via the background lighting, much like the brewery in Exodus. The trick can be effective when used wisely, since I always found the blue Zulag free to be a breath of fresh air, but it also makes me wonder whether there simply wasn't enough development time to give the other Zulags more character. Nevertheless, some details betray the drop in quality, such as how there's less continuity between backgrounds or how they might get reused with just palette swap, and in some cases missing animations between the copy. This technique was also used for secrets outside Rupture farms, but that's fine as the secrets are meant to be bonus gameplay challenges as opposed to part of the canon story, so to speak. And even in that case, some secrets actually feature unique scenery. One of the saving graces is that Rupture Farms is considerably shorter than the brewery, at roughly half its runtime, but even this is undercut by using the level hub as a crutch to divide its segments instead of a more organic layout. In each level, the player is supposed to pull a certain lever before they may advance to the next Zulag, but unlike with the Temple Trials, the game never really explains why this is necessary. I actually think that allowing the players to just blaze through straight to the boardroom from here could have been a bold design decision. All the Zulag levels would then be a nice content reward for players who are actually interested in saving the Mudokons. Despite this marginal decline in presentation quality, this is still Oddworld, so even here we have some bright spots. I'm specifically talking about one more piece of neat environmental storytelling I'd like to point out in Zulag 2. In this first room, the Rupture Farms logo got mustache vandalized and had Moloch sucks written on it, though the text is a bit hard to make out due to the resolution and likely intentional grammatical errors. The mustache doesn't really make much sense, given that none of the species we have seen so far seem to have any kind of facial hair, but I like it anyway precisely because of its absurdity. More than that though, I think it exemplifies, along with the propaganda LEDs and signs, an understated style of humor that is better suited for Oddworld. As for the environmental storytelling part, even though a Mudokon is scrubbing the logo, it probably wasn't the Mudokon that vandalized it in the first place. Ahead of it, there is another graffiti depicting a Slig, but its tone seems to glorify Sligs rather than mock them, implying it might have actually been painted by Sligs themselves. So if I was to extrapolate a vignette out of this, it would be that the logo was also defaced by Sligs, who then probably blamed it on Mudokons and forced them to clean it up. I know I'm probably reading way too much into it, but these fun stories that can be extracted from the Silent World are one of the reasons why I found the first two games so gripping. This is a perfect segue to our last major topic, a discussion about the sentient species in Oddysee, their social dynamics, and by extension the game's message. Because the game's core is political, my interpretation will be informed by my positions, but I will try to maintain objectivity. I will also engage in some speculation about the possible direction of the series, but obviously no matter what my views are, it's Lorne Lanning's that will ultimately direct the franchise. As he has explicitly stated in multiple interviews, he does not consider himself anti-capitalist, let alone a communist, but does think that capitalism should be better regulated for the people's and nature's well-being. He has also expressed sympathies towards anarchism, even describing Abe's uprising as anarchist. Those of you familiar with the left-right political compass may be perplexed by this, as anarchism by its nature is a far-left position advocating for egalitarianism, which leaves this strange gap between his center-right pro-capitalism and anarchist positions. I'm not entirely sure if his opinion on anarchism is one he formed by engaging with literature following an anarchist school of thought, or if it's informally constructed from second-hand, more colloquial definitions of anarchism. That is why, even though I will frame my expectations more around the former definitions of anarchism, there may be large discrepancies whenever later titles are produced. With that out of the way, here is my reading. For starters, Oddysee in a vacuum is not particularly sophisticated political commentary. As demonstrated by its industrial sections, it veers more towards a satirical fable than the deliberately nuanced discourse of other games. When discussing the game's text, I think there are two broad frameworks for which to interpret it. Under the more obvious satirical framework, the themes and the world are to be taken at face value as obviously hyperbolic caricatures, and not so much thought needs to be given to the ramifications when extended to the larger world or across a longer timeline. By contrast, the second approach focuses on deconstruction by trying to create a believable and expansive world and constantly introducing new or related themes as well as re-engaging with existing ones. This environment can sustain a long and nuanced story, and the constant re-examination creates layers to the narrative that invite the media consumer to dwell on the source material for longer, sparking discussion that can lead to new insights. I think Lorne Lanning wants to veer towards this approach, and while Oddysee is more of a squib for all intents and purposes, it does competently set the stage for a larger world and themes that are worth exploring. Perhaps the best way to illustrate the differences would be to explore how each answers the question, what is a social group? In the satirical framework, each group represents an idea. As a result, physical attacks against its members can be interpreted as symbolic attacks against the idea rather than actual physical violence. A consequence of this is that the personalities of its members tend to either define the larger group as a whole or be subsumed by it. This is why, under this framework, Mudokons can only be sympathetic, while Sligs and Glukkons are purely oppressors, which justifies any form of violence against the latter, both as actual self-defense and as symbolic criticism of the institution of slavery that they represent. In the deconstructive framework, however, a social group is much like one in our world. People may associate more closely or loosely with any number of groups, and while there is certainly overlap in what members of any group may believe, there is also heterogeneity in values and opinions. The advantage of the satirical framework is that it efficiently presents its themes, which works well for single titles like Oddysee. On the flip side, it can hit a wall for longer-running series because it quickly exhausts the depths of its characterization. In the context of Oddysee, it can also unfortunately lead to an essentialist conclusion, i.e. that some species are inherently good while others are inherently bad. The deconstructive framework gives more flexibility instead by allowing for more variation in the stances of individual members of any group and allowing them to actually become full-fledged characters capable of change and growth. For Oddysee specifically, by decoupling the character biology from the idea they represent initially, it also allows criticizing ideas directly, instead of by proxy through their personification as an entire species. Due to its length, and as a first title, Oddysee does not have sufficient room to deconstruct its themes, and because they all look identical, it's rather easy to fall back to thinking of Mudokons, Sligs, and Glukkons as uniform gameplay elements rather than individuals. This is better handled in Soulstorm, where many important characters feature unique designs. Still, Oddysee does try its best with what it has, for example by pitch shifting the voices of individual Mudokons and Sligs. I will refer to these frameworks both for Oddysee's restricted scope and when applied to a larger context, but for now let's explore the satirical elements. While there are a few shades of it, at this point in the story, Oddworld hasn't really expanded its scope enough to allow for a deconstructive characterization of its world, but there is definitely a lot of untapped potential. While the social commentary in Oddysee is not groundbreaking when taken piece by piece, a combination of factors makes it unique. First, we have the representation of social classes. From a bird's eye view, Mudokons are wage slaves, Sligs are a private security force, and Glukkons are the corporate overlords. The social order imposed by Glukkons parallels systemic oppression along economic, national, or racial lines in the real world, but is lifted to discrimination across species. The use of relatively uniform groups as representations of different cultural norms, ideologies, or social classes, whether satirical or not, is quite common in, for example, medieval fantasy, but Oddysee stands out because most of its sentient species are distinctly non-humanoid. Oddysee also stands out when compared to fables or satirical works with non-human characters like Orwell's Animal Farm because Oddworld species are completely alien. For example, Orwell relies on the real-life public conception of horses as diligent farm animals to construct the workhorse boxer, who represents hard-working but obedient laborers, an association that Oddysee could not have taken advantage of. Lastly, Oddysee borrows some elements from child-friendly allegories with an Aesop, like Dr. Seuss's The Lorax or The Grinch, through its simple narrative or whenever Abe rhymes, but the whimsy contrasts heavily with grim, realistic portrayals of violence. With all that laid out, now is as good a time as any to start dissecting the main actors in the story. I will preface this with the notion that all the sentient species introduced in Oddysee are eusocial, like bees or ants. This is relevant because the relationship between the queens and their offspring strongly defines each species' character. Naturally, we will start with our protagonists, the Mudokons, who deliberately stand out as the most distinctly humanoid because they are supposed to be the most relatable to the audience. Another reason is that their biology immediately makes Abe's motor capabilities readable and intuitive to the human player. Despite this, Mudokons are still somewhat off-putting physically, being highly emaciated, and pictures of concentration camp prisoners during the Holocaust draw the clearest comparisons. The game abounds with references to both the Holocaust and Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch. For example, Abe's name is short for Abraham, and an easy association is Abraham Lincoln, as a highly prominent abolitionist, but the name Abraham itself is of Hebrew origin, loosely meaning father of nations. Abraham in the Old Testament is an important figure, having established the covenant with the Judaic God in the rather unfortunate form of circumcision. Abe's role as an emancipator is closer to that of Moses, but naming the protagonist that would have been too on the nose. Oddworld Inhabitants' old website stated that Abe was 15 years old at the time of the story, and that Mudokons have lifespans of up to 40 years, which probably unintentionally coincides with the time period that Israelites wandered the desert during their exodus, wink wink, after their emancipation as slaves in Egypt. Moses dies shortly before the exodus concludes, so there is a non-zero chance that Abe may not outlive his revolution either. As we have seen in the native section, Mudokons are very spiritual and have close connections not only with Scrabs and Paramites, but also to the birds and the bees, pun may be intended. I mentioned previously that Mudokons evolved from birds, and this explains why Abe's ponytail is actually formed from feathers instead of hair. It would also be a good way to justify in-universe both Abe's agility and fragility, because birds have hollow bones to help with flight. The Apian connection is more subdued in Oddysee, but becomes obvious in Soulstorm with collectibles like the royal jelly, the honeycomb tombs in the Sanctum, and the mention of their queen, Sam. Though not yet encountered in the games proper, Sam is described as empathetic towards her spawn, and it was she who stitched Abe's lips due to her fear that his constant crying will get him killed. According to the art book, Abe's crying was a reaction to the Mudokons' collective pain caused by his supernaturally increased emotional sensitivity. This sadness is also used as justification for why he is perpetually blue, as Mudokons have chameleonic skin that changes color depending on their mood. Most of the lore I mentioned from the old website is in canon limbo right now, but Sam's imprisonment with the express purpose of breeding slaves non-stop seems to be a preserved plot point. What might have changed would be the circumstances where, rather than forceful imprisonment, the Glukkons instead deceived her into giving up her eggs in exchange for her children's safety. Aside from their physical traits, Mudokon behavior is also defined competently, where they are not always intelligent and may sometimes be unfriendly even towards each other. Their occasional abuse of Abe is grating, but it ultimately works in propping up Abe's unconditional altruism and makes sense given their hostile upbringing. The most contentious aspect of their portrayal is the farts, and Lorne Lanning has gone on record saying that they were probably his biggest mistake, a juvenile attempt at humor symptomatic of the 90s, but there is a good way to organically explain them. Mudokons are neither especially educated nor are they allowed to speak, so it's reasonable that their sense of humor is quite lowbrow and underdeveloped. Moving on to our chief aggressors, the Sligs. In keeping with the satirical framework, they are portrayed as pathologically stupid and abusive, such that the player is never particularly conflicted about inflicting ludicrous amounts of violence against them. However, there is a curious detail in the extended lore that complicates the issue. Apparently, their temperament is not actually their natural predisposition, and they would instead develop into friendly and nurturing creatures. Only the systems set up by the Glukkons in the form of dependence on cybernetic enhancements and the engendering of abusive behavior spark the necessary conditions to twist Sligs into their familiarly sadistic selves. This is compounded by the behavior of their mother, Skillia, who in stark contrast with Sam willingly sells her offspring, both because of a dependency on drugs and the hatred of her own spawn. Shortly after birth, which causes her tremendous pain, baby Sligs must quickly scurry away or Skillia will cannibalize them. Alongside being a graphic and horrifying situation, this implies that the Slig queen gives live birth like most mammals, but apparently without the beneficial effects of oxytocin bonding her and her children. A subplot about how Skillia might have been neurologically compromised by the Glukkons in their desire to obtain a cheap security force breeding facility could be weaved into the overarching story. More importantly though, this nature versus nurture theme of Slig society serves as a good example of re-engagement under the deconstructive framework. In an oblique way, I'd like to tie this to the Slig mask. The Slig's muzzles, possibly a reference to the frightened ones in Goodbye Blue Sky, is a heated debate topic in the Oddworld community regarding which design is better. The original Cyclops-like visor in Oddysee or the binocular mask featured in the original concept art and later titles. On a surface level, my and many others' personal opinion is that the visor simply looks cooler. It makes biological sense to give the Sligs forward vision, and I find the in-universe justification for replacing it because it gave them poor depth perception to not be convincing on Oddworld inhabitants' part. However, I have a deeper reason for endorsing it. Lorne Lanning has mentioned in pre-release interviews for Soulstorm that he wanted the karma system to factor in Slig casualties as well, which unfortunately didn't make it into the release version. Regardless, the binocular mask was meant to make Sligs more expressive and relatable. My intuition is that somewhere down the line, Sligs would slowly start defecting to the Mudokon side. This would be reflected by them adopting more humanly familiar traits and discarding cybernetic implants. This is supported by the unreleased bonus title Sligstorm, which would have involved playing as an albino Slig trying to escape before getting killed for being abnormal. If so, while the switch to the binocular mask makes sense intuitively, the less human-like visor mask is still paradoxically better. One of the game's goals is improving the player's capacity for empathy, so inviting them to relate to prospective friendly Sligs not because of their humanly familiar traits but despite their absence is a much stronger statement about finding common ground and overcoming differences in the name of solidarity. Nevertheless, while I really hope that, despite all their abuses, Slig reform will become a theme for the series moving forward, this one should be handled delicately. Portraying Sligs sympathetically will only work if Sligs earnestly want to turn a new leaf. Carelessly portraying them as sympathetic could distract from the Mudokon's plight and be misconstrued as apologia towards police brutality. As things stand, Sligs are still under the influence of the Glukkons, our final and arguably most important sentient species, given that they are the architects behind the main conflict. The most iconic character in the wall is definitely the Schoolmaster, and a touch of its design is clearly reflected in the Glukkons' appearance, specifically their stature and heads. As a whole, the industrial species seem to form a lexical family of sorts by their orbiting associations with mollusks. While for Sligs and Slogs we have the slug half of the portmanteau, for Glukkons the name is not as indicative, just a corruption of glutton, but their heads strongly resemble octopuses. Glukkons are part of a family of species in Oddworld called Octogi, with a C, introduced in Stranger's Wrath. This also includes Octogi, with a K, imaginative, who are octopus-like parasites that can take over others' bodies by latching onto their heads, and Gloctogi, hulking beasts which are artificial Glukkon-Octogi hybrids. As for specific characters, we have Moloch, whose name is one letter away from mollusk, but also references Moloch, a rival deity in the Old Testament. Like with Mudokons, the Glukkons heavily reference the Old Testament in their names. One is the Magog Cartel, the parent corporation that owns Rupture Farms, named after the mythical opposing tribe of Magog. Another is Nolibab, Babylon spelled backwards, which, in a biblical context at least, is used as a symbol of heresy and depravity, and in Oddworld is the Glukkon city where Sam is held captive. As expected from a satirical reading, Glukkons are similarly pathological except much more cunning and greedy. Their vestigial arms, or rather legs as we will see towards the end, convey the image of a class that does not actually perform any labor of their own and instead delegates work to other species, while using imposing attire with exaggerated shoulder pads to hide their deformities. Much like the other two species, Glukkons have their own queen, Margaret, which is slightly more even-tempered than Scylla, but nonetheless has an abusive relationship with her offspring. She is only considerate of them as long as they turn a profit, and Moloch is stated to be one of her favorites, but the Oddworld website alludes to the fact that this is a two-way street. While she does hold a lot of influence within Glukkon society, this will only last as long as she is fertile. The player isn't meant to feel many qualms about dismantling Glukkon society, at least as it is now. However, the background lore rabbit hole goes quite deep and puts the dynamic between the two main species in a new light. In the past, Mudokons were stated to be at the forefront of technological and cultural development on Mudos, the continent where the action takes place. Despite what seems to be some kind of hegemony, the relationship between Mudokons and Glukkons used to be amicable until the advent of the Mudokon moon, which prompted Mudokons to declare themselves as the chosen race. Out of ostensibly envy, the Glukkons rejected this and segregated themselves into dark caves, where in an effort to disprove this notion they focused first on dark magic and alchemy, which almost led to their extinction. They then pivoted to industrialism, which gave them the firepower to defeat and ultimately enslave the Mudokons. While the moon is still canon, it isn't clear whether this backstory and the resulting schism still is, but if so, it poses some interesting ideological challenges that are worth dissecting. We know this rift ultimately led to the Mudokons' enslavement, but not much context is given about the beginning of the conflict. Always remember that at their core, Oddworld species are intended to reflect real-life situations, so any critique they present is only effective as long as the parallels stack up to reality. What worries me is that if Oddworld wants to preserve this backstory, they might unwittingly write themselves into an unsavory corner. The main issue is framing Mudokons as chosen, which is practically equivalent to superior, and what message this ultimately conveys. On a surface level, the charitable interpretation is that Mudokons being chosen is simply an objective fact of a reality, which the Glukkons ultimately overreacted to, and that their stubbornness in accepting this fact was what led to their corruption. On the opposite spectrum, one could draw the conclusion that Mudokons themselves started to aggressively flaunt their newfound blessing, fomenting the resulting conflict, and that their ultimate fate was a form of intergenerational comeuppance. Unfortunately, both of these interpretations are flawed in distinct ways, so let's break them down and see whether we can come to a more reasonable resolution. The first interpretation does not sit right with me when taken at face value because it doesn't accurately reflect how similar declarations of chosenness panned out in real life. It would be hard to defend such proclamations as innocuous, as it's obvious from history that they more often than not lead to wars, genocides, or ironically, the institutionalization of slavery. Divine right was also often invoked, specifically when circulating and justifying these ideas, but while the Mudokon claim to divine right seems to be supported as fact in the story, as evidenced by the moon, in the real world no similar claims and subsequent atrocities can ever be rationally defended as actually sanctioned by a supernatural third party, and frankly, even if they were, they still wouldn't be ethically justifiable. The second interpretation is also flawed, as the text never presents any evidence for Mudokons having been aggressive towards the other races, moon or no, and instead more emphasis was placed on framing them as enlightened and wise. I find defending claims of such exaltedness to be a questionable message on principle, as reading between the lines suggests they might not have been saints about it either, but we shouldn't jump to the conclusion of ascribing to them some unseen and unmentioned historical crime. Even if that turns out to be true, one can hardly excuse the present severity of the industrialists' reprehensible cruelty not only against Mudokons but also many other life forms. A prequel that explores the tensions and discourse between Glukkons and Mudokons at the time of the schism may be interesting. Unlike Oddysee, it doesn't have to be satire, but can instead be a tragedy of errors that explores the misunderstandings, misfortune, and rhetorical pitfalls both species would have likely engaged in while trying to process this seemingly supernatural event. Likewise, the aftermath, if all the species do manage to rebuild their civilizations cooperatively, is also worth exploring because it's fair to say there will be a continuous risk of discontent as long as the moon exists in its current state. Munch's Oddysee proposes the solution to add more moons for every disenfranchised species that reclaims its freedom, or maybe even villainous species that reforms, and this looks reasonable at a glance, but unfortunately it does not solve the underlying issue. Instead, it only removes it by a variable number of degrees, as now one could still make the unfortunate argument that species unmarked by moons are still somehow lesser. Not only does this fail to address why the Mudokons were initially the only species to deserve a moon when relations were still friendly and stable, but the ethical hang-ups become obvious when juxtaposed with arguments from real-life race realists that take differences in cultural development or the absence of whatever scientific discovery as proof of the inferiority of random social groups. Taking this into account, the best framing in my view is that at some point after the Mudokons' emancipation, they themselves acknowledged the impact of the moon on the schism. Interfering with this narrative that species have to be chosen at all would definitely be an interesting and unexpected twist. The less favorable resolution would be removing the handprint on the moon, but I like this less because it could also symbolize an erasure of past mistakes, which could lead to repetition. Because of that, I propose a more inclusive approach by altering the paw's shape, whether by the Mudokons themselves or through divine intervention doesn't really matter, such that any race may come to identify with it, recontextualizing the cultural landmark as a symbol of unity. Regardless of past and future, in the present the situation is clear. Mudokons are slaves and soon even snacks, so anything less than the complete destruction of Rupture Farms would be an unfavorable concession. Abe's near future as a revolutionary is likely to be a steady crescendo of Magog cartel facility dismemberment, climaxing with the toppling of the cartel itself. This straightforward narrative is good enough, but more related subtopics can be enmeshed with the central conflict. For example, a subplot in Soulstorm is how the Glukkons control the media to frame Abe's existence as a conspiracy theory. This is both because of their incredulity at one of their own being outplayed by a Mudokon and to amortize the growing dissent within their slaves' ranks. Other opportunities in no particular order could be the Slig reform I outlined earlier as one I find most likely to actually happen, Mudokons who are complacent or used as tokens that manage to somehow get a short leg up within the system and who refuse to sacrifice their meager comfort to join the emancipation effort, extremist Mudokons who would either willingly sacrifice their own to fight the system or refuse to compromise at all, Mudokon supremacists that start antagonizing other friendly races, discontent between native and industrial-born Mudokons, and even the emergence of latent splinter factions of Glukkon allies, perhaps academics or unionists, but only as long as they never narratively upstage the Mudokons themselves in their own emancipation efforts. All of these are interesting because they blur the ethical lines between the species and pivot towards the deconstructive framework. Abe turning from a clumsy, bumbling fool to someone who can appeal to all of these increasingly complex factions would also be some phenomenal character growth. But more importantly, it sends the message that beliefs and values can be the product of one's environment and change over time instead of categorically imposed by one's biology and immutable. While there is a risk of overcomplication, I think all of these elements can be satisfyingly balanced. If any suggestions above do not fit the creator's vision, the world is rich enough to support a lot of other interesting ideas, and the only guiding principle should be maintaining coherence with the central narrative. The emancipation plotline is pretty much set in stone, and the story could effectively end with its resolution, but the aftermath is also worth considering and is where I think the two frameworks diverge most significantly. Under the deconstructive framework, a more positive outcome would be to salvage as many of the benign aspects of Glukkon and Slig societies as possible by allowing their reasonable members to overcome their biases and help rebuild a healthier society both for themselves and those around them. Such a development would be impossible under the satirical framework. The static natures of Slig and Glukkon personalities as representatives of exploitations would be a continuous existential threat to Mudokons, so the only option would be their complete annihilation. I hope it's understandable why I find this a less desirable message. While the current rift is gangrenous, the backstory gives hope that it may also heal at some point. Alternatively, Oddworld could entertain both ideas, and Lorne Lanning has played with the notion that Glukkons may be a part of the Magog cartel but not its only members or even the top dogs. The Octogi I mentioned earlier, or the mysterious Magog cartel investors, could act as the irredeemable foils to Glukkons and Sligs, and personally I'm all for adding more freaky creatures, but strictly speaking the story does not need it. At any rate, Glukkon allies may even share some of their less ecologically disastrous technology with the Mudokons to help them rebuild their homeland and temples as reparations. It would allow Oddworld to distance itself from its more anarcho-primitivist tendencies, and having Glukkons pivot to sustainable energy sources would be one hell of a statement. I also must admit I'm not completely comfortable when Oddworld satirizes the medical industry to instead prop up alternative medicine or other pseudoscience. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for criticizing both private and public medical institutions for various abuses. Issues like malpractice, poor management, or financial exploitation by overpricing life-saving medicine or designing suboptimal and addictive drugs are totally fair game. However, none of those have anything to do with the essence of medical science or the scientific method. Opening a textbook about smallpox or polio shows how awful pain and suffering could get without it. Also, let's be real, alternative medicine is just as financially motivated. If there was more time, I would have talked about the Vikers as well, as they are most related to this topic, but frankly I never found them that compelling because I find their design boring and their silly Mengele mannerisms a little bit too silly. In general, I think Oddworld would only elevate itself by interrogating its take on mysticism and spirituality. Unlike in our world, Oddworld magic is empirically demonstrable, and much like any tool, it can be used both positively and negatively. It would be interesting to see how the Mudokons' unique skills would be integrated in a shared society. As an example, consider how in a fairer Oddworld community, the Mudokon ability to possess members of other species, no matter how rare, may leave them with totally legitimate concerns regarding their own bodily autonomy.
Mullock saw what I was doing. He was pissed. He ordered us all killed.
Anyway, there are countless similar musings to be had, and I don't want to cut them short, but we are drawing to the end, and the last hurdle is the boardroom. If the Holocaust references cannot get more obvious, Mullock's final solution is to gas the Mudokons, which sets off a 2-minute timer. A cool detail is that the timer displays are tied to gas pumps, which can be seen in the background throughout Rupture Farms, retroactively reinforcing the threat the Mudokons were always under in case of rebellion. Design-wise, the boardroom is a much shorter and simpler climax than the temple nests. The 2-minute time limit is lenient enough if you know the layout, and a good 30 seconds can be shaved off if the player notices the shaded ledge leading to the electric fence lever. The obstacles are only static explosives and meat saws, and the final standoff in the boardroom with the Shrikul is a good closer. Abe's ultimate fate hinges on how many Mudokons the player rescued. At 50 Mudokons or more, you have the good ending. A variation of it, the perfect ending, is unlocked at over 99 Mudokons. This rewards you with a real menu from which to watch any cinematic, a reward that didn't age very well because of YouTube. In the bad ending, the player is sent back to Rupture Farms' Return to try again and rescue enough Mudokons, but what probably fewer players know is the secret dark ending, obtained by killing as many Mudokons as you can. Strangely enough, it's this ending that actually gives a substantial gameplay benefit, as the player is sent back to redo the third act, but now with infinite grenades. Regardless, the difference between the two main endings is vast. The gruesomeness of the bad ending is sure to make players feel uncomfortable, while the good ending is appropriately satisfying. Well, that about wraps things up. The 90s were rife with cult classics that people today hold close to their hearts. For some it's Planescape Torment, for others it's Grim Fandango, and there are others still, but for me that honor goes to Abe's Oddysee, which is why I've been burning to make this project. If you're new to the series, I hope it sparked your interest. Although I spoiled most of everything, you can still try Oddysee for yourself, or better yet play Exodus to experience an unexplored original Oddworld title, as despite my earlier comparison, it's still an excellent sequel. Additionally, if you are interested in more Oddworld content, check out Pup Benny for more focused lore breakdowns, as well as Pixel Pursuits and Caddicarus channels for their reviews. Reliable Rhubarb not that long ago released an Oddworld making of documentary that might interest you for a more historical breakdown of the company and the game's development. HTML has a very good video about inconsistencies in creature designs between titles, and Pologates and Oddworld levels, hacks and more are channels focused on modded custom levels. I will include links to these in the description, as well as to any other sources that come to mind. As always, if you have any notes, ideas, disagreements, or would like to point out any mistakes, the comments are yours for the taking. Hopefully see you around, and thank you for watching.
Well, I rescued Mudokons. But who's gonna rescue me? Cause here I am, face to face. With Mullock the Glukkon.